All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening, Chris. Welcome back. Do you mean welcome back from Saturday? Uh, and hey, Devin. David. That's great. I went into stasis, for the last 2.5 days, and now I'm out. They only let me out for webinars. You know how it is. Um, okay, um, we're going to be talking about directly about the law of non-contradiction today. It's funny. Well, this is again one of those cases where whether or not I do it justice, we'll find out. But it's very possible that there may be nobody who is been as obsessed or who has been as obsessed with the law of non-contradiction specifically for the last about almost 20 years now. It might be 18 years or something since I came across it. But I've used it kind of on purpose and been really, especially when I first came across it, I was really obsessed with using it, and that's never gone away. It just becomes more kind of baked in to what I do. Um, I mentioned Fletch in the post here because he wrote me several months back and said that what I referred to about contradictions, it had really kind of hit him in a new and separate way, where previously he had been like using the advice and stuff from Law of Implication, which is the name of what I named, like the umbrella name for my teaching, whatever you call it, my recordings and so forth, and live talks at OMG Live. That he'd been using like advice from it in nuggets, and it was great. But when what I was saying about contradictions really hit him in a new way, and he said it just made so much difference. A total game changer when he looked at it, and also when he let that kind of break his model for things rather than just sort of not have that happen. Just sort of use what I'm saying kind of within a little bit too much within the frame that he already had without realizing it. So however good a job I do, so to speak, on this webinar, then don't leave it up to me from your perspective. Go, and I'll just kind of say explicitly that the law of non-contradiction can kind of break things wide open for you. Logic by itself is not like the only key to thinking clearly. Really, alchemy is, like I talked about in the first and second webinars, where you are operating within something like a scenario, within the type of thing that you experience in your conscious field, the way the world seems, right? What you'd think of as tangible, even if you're imagining something in your mind, then where we've done a lot of this by now with scenarios where it relates to like our model for real life. It can be a fantasy like a unicorn, but it's still not just an abstract statement that's like not tied to anything you can kind of grasp or picture or feel in some way or hear. And alchemy refers to the idea of like you don't proceed logical steps is actually not that great a characterization or a way to imagine the method of thinking clearly and building on what you know. Logic, as I mentioned, it actually refers to, and I have slides, but I'll just talk for a little while. I'm just kind of talking a little bit casually here, almost like we're in discussion mode for a little while. Then I'll get to slides and so forth. But I just kind of want to talk to you a little bit about this, sort of personally, and just, I don't know, give a little background and what I'm saying. So logic alone doesn't really let you build. Logic is more like something that you need to not violate while you're building, right? So let's see if we try to apply this to building a house, then we could either think of it perhaps as the mortar around the bricks. You don't build a house only of mortar, but you don't violate it. Or you could just think of it as like the blueprint or being careful. Let's suppose if you're laying brick, then if you do it carefully and precisely, then you don't want to violate that, right? You don't want it to be all sloppy, or you don't want to violate whatever other general best practices there are. Same thing if you're ranking a website. But you don't. But best practices aren't the stuff that you build with, right? It's when you're building you don't violate best practices or correct methodology and so forth. So logic, it refers to not changing the meanings of your words. So while you build using alchemy, using scenarios where you're adding something in, you're changing one piece, right? You're working back in time. You're saying, well, what if I try to rank 2 websites instead of 1, right? So that introduced another element. What if I go into a client meeting having some kind of proof versus imagining going into a client meeting without it? What I mean is that's like alchemy, just asking questions like that. What if I add this in? What if I add an element of proof into my scenario that I'm building out for thinking through a meeting that I might have? And by the way, when you do that, you might discover that although obviously it's better to have proof, you might say, well, let me think of how a meeting could go where I don't have proof. And could it work out? And it could, right? If you have a certain type of knowledge, if you operate within a certain type of velvet ropes that Cotton talks about, then perhaps they're not going to ask you for certain proof elements. But all I'm doing is I'm not trying to talk about client meetings. I'm just using that as an example of alchemy, where you add in an idea, you take out an idea, you walk it forward, you ask like, what if? But what if I remove this element? What if I add this element in, right? While you're doing that, you don't want to violate logic. And today we're going to be honing in on logic, but logic again is part of the alchemy process. It's not a substitute for it. It isn't alchemy itself, like all by itself. And it doesn't really have power. It's just something that if you violate it, it's going to like screw you up. In that way, it has power, but it doesn't. You need to, as I said, you're basically doing alchemy, but while you're doing it, you don't want to contradict, and you don't want to equivocate. Equivocate means changing the meanings of your words. Again, I'm just sort of talking casually here for a moment, so it's okay if I say some stuff and it doesn't perfectly compute or whatever for a moment. I came across the law of non-contradiction, specifically named as such, in a book called Not a Chance by a guy named R, initials R, and then C, and then Sproul, S-P-R-O-U-L. And again, the book was called Not a Chance. And I've been interested in evolution. It's funny, when I was 5 years old, I was interested in dinosaurs, very interested in that sort of thing, and natural history, that sort of thing. I see with my son, who's 4, he's just crazy about trucks. Everything's about trucks. Well, pretty much almost literally everything. Everything's about trucks. Although he's been jumping around like a frog lately as well. But mostly it's about trucks. And which is kind of cool because we have like some construction going on. I think AT&T is laying some pipes, and he has there's a backhoe a couple blocks down. And there was no dinosaurs running around a couple blocks away. It would have been pretty fascinating. Maybe scary, but fascinating. But I didn't get to have that. But anyway, I was interested in dinosaurs, and then I became interested in like evolution versus creation, and that whole kind of discussion, debate, whatever you want to call it, intelligent design, that sort of thing. Especially around age 16, 17, 18, I read like every book I could find on it while I was in college. But one of the, and it was a big part of shaping my path, because it meant that in college, I always kind of didn't really have much of, like kind of intuitively, and maybe because of my conceptual ability and so forth, didn't really buy into the whole authority thing, where people were just supposed to be right just because of their status, or because they were older, or they had a certain job, like professor, or kindergarten teacher when I was in kindergarten, whatever it might be. If people could give me a reason why it made more sense to listen to the teacher, like such as that it would just make things less chaotic and we could do activities better, then that made sense. But just believing someone or them being right just because they were an authority figure didn't make sense to me even when I was 5. Um, which has benefits and drawbacks, right? There's benefits to operating within the system, but I haven't really gotten to benefit from that. But when I was in college, I went to the University of Virginia. Thank you, Sandra, for that. So I went to the University of Virginia, and I was pre-med, so it was all science classes. And when I was in high school, I took both normal chemistry and biology, of course, and stuff. But then I took the AP course. You pick one when you're a senior in high school in the track that I was on, and I picked advanced placement chemistry and got an A+ in that. Not trying to impress you with a grade that I got in high school, but just giving you a little bit of that. And then, but then I took pre-med classes. So I was all kind of immersed in the hard sciences, so to speak, for my college career, especially for the first 2 years. I changed my mind about going the med school path between my second and my third year at UVA over the summer. I kind of got the bug I did an internship with doctors, and then I got a bug for working for myself. But I both read a lot about evolution and stuff related, and I had the background for it within reason. And even if you were to go on to med school, you're learning specific stuff about medicine. You're really in the Bachelor of Science, BS. I'm not joking there. There's actually called BS classes, and then there's Bachelor of Arts classes, which are basically easier, but not necessarily easier to get an A, but more dumbed down. But I took mostly Bachelor of Science classes at UVA, which was one of the top pre-med or the top ranked pre-med school in U.S. News and World Report at the time. My professors wrote the books and for the most part and so forth, the textbooks that we were using. And so I really had about as much background as anyone because there's not that much more. Like if you go into grad school and so forth, it's really much more about being specialized and doing experiments and so forth. Rather than the whole foundation. I'm pretty conversant with that. I've forgotten some of the details at this point, but what was interesting was the professors would know a lot of details, and they were good at what they did in a certain way, but their ability to think in another way was shockingly shockingly shocking. I don't know what to say, but it was so bad. Like, I'll just talk about this for a few minutes, just because I'm passionate about it in a sense. So in that way, it's kind of interesting. Otherwise, I understand that it's not the main topic we usually talk about. But Charles Darwin started evolution, right? Evolutionary theory with the idea that it's a pretty simple idea, right? And it's pretty easy to keep track of the ideas. There's two ideas. There's the idea that organisms have more offspring than can survive, right? They have too many kids. And then there is mutation, like nature throws up variation, essentially. And so there's too many kids and there's variation, right? Mutation, right? Also that's said as, oh, there's a little bit of music playing in the background. It's from brain.fm. It's relaxed, focused music. I'm trying it out. Not sure whether it matters or not. I have a directional mic, so you shouldn't get too much of it. I did not think you guys could hear it, but maybe it'll give you a little bit of relaxed focused as well. You can do a survey at the end, but we'll try it this time. Anyway, and evolution is it's as good as any, maybe one of the best things actually. It was the thing that helped me, so maybe it's a great example. And probably not overly emotional for people, like I know it a little bit for some people one way or the other, but it's not like too much at the heart of things probably for most of us. I'll turn the music down just a notch or two. Okay, they're starting to distract me now that was pointed out. So, all right. So evolution, so it's interesting. There's two parts to it. It's mutation and natural selection, also characterized as chance and necessity by a guy named Jacques Monod and others. But what's interesting about it is you can't really mess with that theory too much. Like when evolutionists are trying to defend it, they'll keep meandering outside of the theory and adding in new elements. But but the theory really is the theory. It is and anyway, so we'll stick with that, and if it comes up what I'm trying to say better, then I'll meander in that tangent. But so let me put it on a slide here. So we have mutation and natural selection. Also, these are just the rewording of it, chance and necessity. And I'm well aware of the details and things like punctuated equilibrium and this, that, and the other thing. It's also where I came across the idea of attractors and local peak theory for the first time. And a lot of my, the other thing that's interesting about evolution that's applicable for everybody is that non-conscious processes generally follow the same pattern because there's no consciousness messing with them. And these patterns come up all over the place in life. So evolutionary theory has actually a whole lot of applications in real life. Even it's actually, for the most part, a false theory. But the thought, the components of it, like I say, local peak theory, and understanding how it really works and so forth, is applicable. Okay, I'll go back to the Facebook group just because, but you can at least see this, just so you see what I'm referring to. So if we have, what we can do then is we can boil it down to the idea that so the thing that was so exciting for so many people about evolutionary theory is the whole point of it was to explain the origin and the diversity of life, right? That again, and that has to be, that we also want to keep in mind, right? We can also doing a little bit of alchemy practice here, so adding in elements and so forth. So the whole point of evolutionary theory is to explain the diversity of life and the origin of it. If we're not doing that, it doesn't really have a whole lot of that kind of is what excited people about it. It also, people use it to try to come up with like social theories of why people do things the way they do, and why even sometimes women do the way they do. Or you'll see people refer to evolutionary theory all the time when they're writing about the mind or behavior, or in the world of dating and pickup, and guys teaching about dating and pickup, they'll often refer to evolutionary theory and something called like what is it? I think social evolutionary biology, evolutionary sociobiology, or something like that. But you'll hear this all the time. They'll say, "Oh, we evolved this way because it helped survival, because it helped this, that, and the other thing." If we try to take an element away, if we take away the idea of natural selection, then we just have, and this is alchemy, right? We take away one concept. Are we left with a workable theory? Well, then we just have the idea that there's mutation. Later on, there's genetic recombination, right? Obviously, that's what we see when we have kids, right? Now there's sex, which recombines genes. You don't even need, human DNA can mutate, but that's not the main reason why when you have a kid who doesn't look like you, it's not because they're a mutant, right? It's because it's a long word, but it's a simple concept, genetic recombination, right? Your DNA, your mate's DNA, and they kind of break apart and recombine it at random, right? It's not fully random, but for the sake of our purposes, right? So each kid you have will look different, and again, not because they're a mutant, but because of recombination. But recombination is pretty much irrelevant. We can just discard it for worrying about evolutionary theory because we're trying to explain the diversity of life, and you can't get diversity just by recombining, right? The diversity has to come from creating new stuff, which can only happen through mutation, right? Recombination doesn't create. You could say it creates new combinations, but only new combinations, so it's already there. Um, all right, so we put that aside. So we removed something that could just be confusion, which is sexual reproduction, genetic recombination. And so we have chance making variation in different offspring. If you only have that and you have no driving force whatsoever, then um, what would that look like? If let's suppose that starting with bacteria, every single child just lives its whole lifespan out, then you'd just have a lot of different stuff. I guess you'd have what would that um, certain there wouldn't be anything driving uh, the you get diversity in the sense of just a whole lot of mutations. Some things couldn't live at all, right? Um, Mostly you just have a lot of you kind of end up back with the issue of survival, which is different than natural selection, right? Suppose we, again, this is alchemy in action when we're thinking this through and using scenarios. Suppose we, and let me just try using something other than bacteria for a moment to see if it helps as well. If you have a bunch of rabbits, right, and you have like a whole continent into which they can breed, and there's no predators, there's nothing kind of stopping them, right? Well, let's start with no predators, then we can add some in. Then they're going to, if you have, let's say you start with rabbits that are perfectly good at surviving already, and then they just breed and they have different mutations, then mostly they're just going to be worse. If something's better, it doesn't really matter because there isn't. We just took out natural selection. But even then, maybe it still has more kids. Maybe if you say the natural lifespan of a rabbit is whatever, I don't know, like 5 or 10 years or 3 years or whatever, um, and one lives longer, we kind of end up getting back to who's better at making more kids no matter what, even if there's not like natural selection because of escaping predators or whatever else, you're still stuck with a situation where if they're going to somehow make more kids, then there's going to be more of those kids. But if the other ones survive as well, then we'll have some sort of diversity. But if you have a kind of valley that rabbits can't cross where let's see, so a mutation, if a rabbit got born that was a little bit more like a cat, but when you understand the details, you're looking at like an RNA, like one RNA on a whole, like one letter out of a book or something being changed or something like that. But so you would need to make thousands and thousands of rabbits that are newly mutate with new mutations that all on the same line that have the previous mutation, and that has to stack um, tens of thousands of times or maybe hundreds or millions of times in the same line of rabbits in order to get to a cat, and they'd all have to at least survive. But there's nothing whatsoever driving it without some driving force. Like natural selection doesn't actually make that happen either, but at least in the theory, there's a driving force with natural selection. I'm a little bit poking around with you in real time while we're doing this. Um, uh, there's always a possibility it'll end up not being a little tangential, but there's some way in which this was such a good bouncing off point for me in just realizing how there, there's this idea of intimidation where we tend to feel like some other people have things figured out better than us. There's this powerful like kind of force where we feel like experts must have it figured out better than us. And there was something so freeing for me, so powerful, when I saw that professors just couldn't even come close to getting things straight. So if we go back to the simple idea with evolution, where it's basically about producing more grandkids, right? Whoever can survive and produce more offspring, then the theory says that's what that the history will kind of drive towards that, right? That you'll end up getting organisms that are better at producing grandkids, right? Better at surviving and having kids that then go on to have kids, right? If I say grandkids, because if you have kids that are sterile or if you have kids that die immediately, then you're not getting anywhere. But if you have more grandkids, then you're pretty much set, right? So if we boil it down to something that simple, which is you have mutation, and then whatever mutations end up helping you produce more grandkids. And the very idea of mutation is a great example of what we talked about last time, which is where we want to go to the extreme, make things big and simple and obvious. Normally when people think about, and I'm a little poking around here, but I don't know, somehow I suspect that this can give you something or give you kind of a backdrop. That can be helpful. That the facts may or may not be helpful, but there's something about this exercise that I want to do with you. A couple things. So normally when people, not only a layperson, but actually even professors, when they think about mutation, professors even who know better, but when they think about it, they tend to think in terms of like a gross morphological, a large change. Like people think about the X-Men or something, right? The Marvel superheroes, but even if we just think about it in terms of squirrels, and becoming flying squirrels, or non-flying birds, or proto-birds growing developing wings or evolving wings, then people tend to think in terms of what's called like gross morphology, or outer changes that are starting to make progress, like the beginning of a wing or the beginning of an eye, right? Like a sensory organ that could detect light or something like that. But when you, in this case, zoom in so that something that's kind of blurry, like thinking of a mutation in terms of the beginning of a wing, or the beginning or a monkey's developing the beginning of the ability to speak, or a brain, the speech center in a brain. When you look at what's going on more closely, then the only thing we have to work with when it comes to mutation is every DNA is made up of like a series of letters, and there's basically 4 letters, and there's basically four different types of letters, like as if it was like A, B, C, and D, although we can abbreviate them differently based on the names of in science. But if we just think A, B, C, and D right now, and so you're making a sequence with DNA with only those letters, and a mutation is changing one letter. There's 4 different possible letters, like A, B, C, and D, but every 3 letters, like A, or A, B, D, or whatever, if I have my memory right, then every 3 codes for one amino acid, which is one part of a protein. And so a mutation is you're changing one letter. You're changing ABB to ABC, and that's going to make a different amino acid in one of the many proteins in your body. That's it. That's the entire thing the mutation does. That has a fairly shocking effect, right? Like when you genetically recombine and you have different genes. But even then, that's not mutation. It's huge. It's huge blocks of proteins being switched for other huge blocks when we're talking about sexual reproduction and genetic recombination. But a mutation just changes, again, it just at random changes. You take a working protein, which can have dozens or hundreds, or I think even thousands of amino acids in a whole chain. And that makes it have a whole configuration. And that can be like your hemoglobin in your body. It can be, they just do a bazillion different things, enzymes in your cells. But that's where like your whole body develops from these different proteins working in different ways, which is kind of amazing all by itself. But you change one amino acid at random out of dozens or hundreds in one protein, and that's it. That's entirely what a mutation does. You could have one organism that changes a whole bunch of those at random in different places or something, but it's still just at random changing from a working protein, changing it at random. You don't like have a mutation for a wing. You have a mutation for one deformation, one amino acid changing out of dozens or hundreds in one protein. out of thousands, or a few of those, if you get bombarded with enough radiation or something. That's it. That's entirely what a mutation is. When you see it that way, then trying to go from one organism to another it starts to become bizarre, right? People could say, oh, well, monkey DNA and human DNA is over 99% the same. Well, over 99% the same, again, it's just a very blurry way of looking at it. In that 1% difference is a massive amount of specific mutations that would have to occur on I think, well over 100,000, probably millions. Those details I'm fuzzy on at this point. Each and every one of those would need to provide, according to the scheme of mutation and natural selection, you need to have a monkey with one different little amino acid on the way to being a human. That would have to do one of two things. Either it would be almost completely irrelevant, right, or a little bit detrimental. In which case, if you have a population of 1,000 monkeys, and one monkey has a kid with a mutation that's pretty much entirely irrelevant, then what's going to happen? Then essentially that mutation will be like 1/1000th of the gene pool, right? It might die out by chance. That monkey might just end up getting killed or something like that, or the monkey might reproduce, but it would have no particular reason why it would make more offspring than anything else, right? We said I don't know that there's been any actual examples of an actual mutation that's been seen in real life where it, like in something like a monkey or a tree sloth or an oak tree, where all of a sudden that just takes over the population. After the fact, you can say, oh, look, these finches have a longer beak, so when there's a drought, the population skews toward the finches with larger beaks, but those larger beaks were already there in the gene pool. And then, like Darwin had a big deal with finches, and that's what sparked his whole theory, according to the story. Ironically, though, several years later, after he measured the rapid change in beak size based on like a drought, they were back to the normal beak size after the water came back anyway. But we're talking about actually having a mutation happen new, not just looking at variation that's already there, and just once in a while, environmental changes can make a huge difference. But this and what I'm doing with you now, you can apply the exact same thing to anything in business or relationship, right? I'm just giving you a really detailed example of how to use a scenario that you can also then go out into real life and say, wow, people don't know this. Almost everyone believes in evolution, and various religious people and a few maybe non-religious people, but mostly religious people believe in some sort of creation or intelligent design. But a lot of people, of course, believe in evolution, and a lot of people are really, really condescending about it. But what they're asserting is that if you were to think about monkeys, one mutation, either it just stays 1/1000th of that population of 1,000 monkeys, and there's no reason why it really would do anything much different than that, right? Maybe the monkey gets killed, maybe it by luck grows into like 2% of the population. It's basically impossible for it to grow into like a large amount of the population because it doesn't convey much advantage at all. How much can like one amino acid different in one protein do for a monkey? Then any further mutation, remember we have to do about 10,000 like 100,000 on the order, it could be a million or whatever, but let's just say it's 100,000 for the sake of picturing it. We need to do 100,000 of these, and they all have to be in the same lineage, right? Because if a different monkey has a mutation that is on the way to being a human, one of the 100,000 that you need, and I think it's just way more than 100,000, by the way. But anyhow, even if it's 100,000, then we could say, well, they don't have to happen in the same monkey. one monkey named Joe could have a mutation, and then Beatrice could have a mutation, and then they could have kids, and later their kids could marry and have kids, and that kid could have both. But you haven't done anything by saying that. The odds of them doing that wash out with the odds of it all happening in the same lineage, right? So either it happens in the same lineage or about the same improbability or probability. It happens at something else, and then those get combined in some kid later down the road, right? Once we start to do this with alchemy, where we're adding one element at a time, and do you see how this is not a logical syllogism? It's not like a logical progression or a set of axioms that I'm doing. I'm doing alchemy in front of you, as usual, right? I'm dealing with something that's pretty tangible, pretty much related to something we can picture, that relates to our experience of real life. I don't mean that relates exactly to something that you've dealt with in your life, but it's tangible, right? What I'm talking about. And once we do this with evolution, it falls apart everywhere, in every way, all over the place, in 1,000 different places. But let's keep going with it with the monkeys. So now you have a population of 1,000 monkeys. In only one of those monkeys, right? Flash forward 100 years. Now there's still one monkey with a mutation on average, because it didn't bestow much survival advantage. And what if it gave like a 5% survival advantage? What if it even doubled the chance of survival? Then what? The monkey still could have gotten killed, or maybe there's 2 monkeys out of 1,000. If that one amino acid change bestowed such an immense survival advantage that it took over the whole gene pool over the course of 100,000 years, then okay. But now the only monkeys would be that new mutation. There's none of the previous monkeys left, if you say that, right? Like, again, I'm just keep it consistent with what I'm saying. So now it could be the case that you have the original population of 1,000 monkeys, you have a mutation, and for no discernible reason, that guy goes and he moves somewhere else, somehow has sex with himself and produces offspring, right? Or somehow he produces some male and female kids, they go off by themselves in a whole different rainforest and start making kids. And that however and now that happened for no reason, right? And they make a whole population out of just those two that somehow got made and went off. So if we imagine that type of theory, then it's no less ridiculous, right? We can develop that in a moment if we want, but let's stay where it's in the same location. Then you have, again, one kid, and again, we could say it wipes out the entire population, but then that we need to imagine, however we do it, if we imagine it wipes out the whole population over 100,000 years or something, then those are the only monkeys with that mutation. All the previous monkeys are gone. And then we need to imagine another mutation happening that also conveys such an advantage that it wipes out the rest of the population over the next 100,000 years. And those are all the only monkeys left are now with both mutations. And then that repeats itself, where we keep having one change in an amino acid. And you could have like what seems like a huge mutation where instead of one letter changing, you splice one whole set of letters over somewhere else in DNA. There's that idea. And all this changes nothing. If you make a massive change, if you make a massive random cut and change in one protein, then it doesn't change the game much at all. Even if you made it in a zillion proteins, the odds of survival would be infinitesimal, right? Anyway, mutations in real life that we observe are almost entirely never beneficial. The only even examples that I'm aware of that are clearly beneficial are in response to with bacteria and in response to antibacterial things. And then those are easy because they're just changing like a lock and key mechanism. When you have bacteria evolving to become resistant to like penicillin or whatever, then then that's the kind of thing that mutation actually can do, because the the inner workings might be a little anyway. Logically speaking, it basically has something to do with a receptor and key mechanism, where something's being recognized by the antibacterial thing and dissolved or killed, whatever. And then when you change that combination, it's no longer recognized. Notice that all of these superbacteria or strains that are resistant to, what's the word? I'm forgetting, antibacterial. I'm forgetting the main word for antibacterial stuff. Antibiotics. Notice they're always bacteria and not oak trees or whatever. What I mean is the bacteria that keep evolving and evolving to be resistant to antibiotics, they're still bacteria, right? They, however much they evolve, lo and behold, they don't even turn into single-celled organisms with nuclei, right? They're, after all this time, we still have bacteria. And yet, all the other diversity of life that we're supposed to see was supposed to come from chance and natural selection operating on bacteria, which means somehow bacteria, this is yet another branch of craziness and contradicting the original theory. And this is how we avoid equivocation, is we need to clearly see the original thing we're comparing to. In order to look for contradictions, we need to fix our mind on the original thing that we're trying to match or mismatch. I've talked about that as well, right? Matching and mismatching. When the way evolutionists defend their theory is they equivocate like nuts. They start with this theory of mutation and natural selection, and then they put it off the screen, and then they introduce a whole new thing that's different, like just the fact that there's change over time. Evolution, instead of meaning producing more grandkids, which is what the actual theory is, they all they do is illustrate that things change over time. Um, uh, um, and again, and pretty much the only place where you're going to see mutation helping something really survive in an observable way, instead of calling something mutation after the fact. Meaning that if you already believe in the theory of evolution and then you see a bird, you say, oh, this bird's wings all came from mutations from a proto-bird, right? So you look at all the diversity in life as evidence of mutation by begging the question. Okay, so we'll stick with, we'll get back to our monkeys. Oh, wait, there's one thing I just want to close one quick loop I was saying. So the theory of evolution clearly states, there's no question about this, that it's the ability to, it's the drive to have more grandkids that is driving the diversity of life. And so at one point there was just single-cell organisms without nuclei, according to, I believe that as well, by the way. I believe in, or I calculate or assess, whatever, that there was such a thing as faunal succession. FAUNAL, it just refers to like living organisms. There's been a succession of living organisms. I think the Earth was 4.6 billion years old, and that at one point there was no life, and then there was bacteria or single-celled organisms, prokaryotes without nuclei, and then single-celled organisms with nuclei, and then multi-celled organisms, and so on and so forth. So roughly, like we are taught, I agree that is the case. However, evolution can't explain it at all. Can't even come close. Because when you're talking about having more grandkids, just on the face of it, if a bacteria is trying to have more grandkids, does that drive it to become an oak tree? Right? Evolutionary theory, the grand scale evolutionary theory, literally teaches that the ancestor of a oak tree at some point, if it goes back enough generations, was a single-celled organism, like something like a bacteria, right? Or at least a one-celled organism with a nucleus, whatever. One-celled organisms are really good at making grandkids. They're super duper at it, right? So are cockroaches and so forth. Oak trees are actually really bad at making grandkids, right? They're really slow to do so. So if you're trying to produce more grandkids faster, basically, or just more, then you pretty obviously that's not going to cause a single-celled organism to be pushed towards becoming an oak tree. Do you see? So just just simply looking at the theory, that doesn't work. And there isn't a counter, there isn't any kind of coherent argument to clear up what I said. An evolutionist would just sort of their technique would be to roll their eyes, look scientific, and change the subject, attack me personally, just whatever, just confuse the issue, and so forth. And then I'll be done with this after I do the monkey thing, and then we'll continue with my slides and topics more specific to OMG. But it again, I do find it amazing how just thinking things through this way just shatters the ripple effect. If evolutionary theory is just ridiculous, and if it's just ridiculous to believe in it, that it could work, and to believe it, you have to believe this scheme that I'm telling you about the monkeys as one of many things. You also have to believe that oak trees are better at producing grandkids than bacteria. You also have to wonder why there's still single-celled organisms, because they kept mutating to become better at survival, which means not better at survival, but better at having more grandkids. Why are the originals still there? But again, the monkeys will make it particularly clear. And you might be seeing it pretty clearly already, where you right, and if you need so these monkeys, you either have this mutation, this one change in one protein, or a whole one shift that has a ripple effect where it has a whole bunch of changes in a lot of proteins. And that either conveys a great survival advantage, which is incredibly unlikely, and I don't know that's ever actually been observed, or and you know it is observed. If you take a bunch of different dogs that have been bred intentionally to be distinct breeds, and you put them in the wild, what happens? Experimentally, scientifically, they revert to wild type. They all turn into mutts, basically, right? They turn into dog, like what we think of as a generic dog. They don't. The diversity doesn't expand, and generally the more specifically bred a dog is, the worse it is at surviving. And that's just that's not mutation either. It's pretty much as far as I'm aware, it's again genetic recombination, right? Making sure you only breed dogs that are the same breed. Again, evolutionists see all diversity as mutation, so it keeps them from noticing that they actually don't observe actual mutations, where they have a dog somewhere that has an actual mutation, right? To see that, they'd have to sequence the DNA of the parent and and both parents and the child to see the mutation. It's pretty hard to find, and then they'd have to see how that leads over many generations to greater survival rate, which would take hundreds of years or hundreds of thousands of years to observe. So there's nothing scientific in observing that way. As a matter of fact, there's tons of scientific observation done all the time with populations of bacteria, populations of of higher organisms, and so forth. And every time, I think literally except for genetic recombination, where you have like a lion and a tiger having a liger or something. But in every case where you have two parents that are the same species having a child, what happens? What's the child? Same species, right? In every observable case that I'm aware of. So once again, actual science in the case of observing, doing, and so forth, just keeps on reporting, giving us back the information that species give birth to members of the same species every time. So these monkeys, what really would happen is most every mutation on a monkey on the way to being a human would actually be neutral. It wouldn't really help its survival that much, right? If it didn't just make it much worse at surviving, then it wouldn't help. So really what you're going to have is one monkey out of 1,000 going on generation after generation has one mutation out of 100,000 or many million. And then that particular one needs to be the one with the next mutation. And then that needs to happen And remember, there's an incredible array of mutations that can happen. The massive, massive, vast majority of which are not closer to making a speech center in the brain, or making vocal cords that can speak, like a physical ability to speak and form words, plus a speech center in the brain. And if you make part of that, it doesn't help you. You need, like, it doesn't make you more survivable. You need like a lot of it at once. And so we have to imagine either there's this line of 1 out of 1,000 monkeys, and that line just keeps having the exact right mutation over and over again, which is not natural selection. It's just neutral drift, right? And so we've just thrown out the natural selection part anyway. So it's not evolutionary theory anyway. As soon as you remove natural selection, you're not talking about evolutionary theory. You're just talking about no theory. You're just saying this crazy thing just happened. Once you introduce natural selection, as soon as you say it's neutral, now you say the natural selection isn't driving you anywhere. So once again, you don't have evolution. And then if you say it bestows a survival advantage, then first of all, that's an extraordinary claim to suppose that one tiny difference, one amino acid difference in a protein or something like that, bestows a tremendous survival advantage on a monkey that caused it to basically wipe out the rest of the population and replace the whole gene pool with this mutation. If that were to keep happening, if that did happen 100,000 or 1,000,000 times, and it would be a pretty important question at that point whether it would need to happen 100,000 times or 1,000,000 times, right? Big difference. We have 900,000 to go if it's 1,000,000 rather than 100,000. And if it's 10 million, then that's a whole lot more times. You'd have to wipe out the entire population of monkeys every single time, right? And then we have the very bizarre thing of where we actually still have monkeys. So we have monkeys living just fine without being able to talk and so forth. And yet there's apparently been 100,000 steps, each of which were massively better at survival than the existing monkeys. An evolutionist might try to obfuscate or confuse things by saying, well, no, there was this proto-monkey, and then it evolved in two directions, to the monkeys we see today and to humans. Well, once again, we're left with still saying that the monkeys we see today are massively better at survival than the proto-monkey. What, they're equal to humans? Are they worse than humans? If they're worse, why aren't they being wiped out? You just, anytime you try to fix the theory, you just end up with more nonsense. And we can go on forever doing that. But really what the theory says is what I said, is that you have these monkeys, and repeat this with everything, right? It's not just monkeys and humans. We're talking about before you had birds, right? Before you had any sort of reptile. Tree sloths have a very complex behavior. There's all sorts of very unique and complex animals, and we have to suppose that either they popped around randomly, which is, again, is not what evolutionary says in the first place. Evolutionary theory says that a platypus, however different it is from what it evolved from, it has such a massive, it has this massive number of greatly helpful mutations, each of which wiped out the gene pool of the previous thing on the way from whatever started the platypus going, the ancestor. There was mutation after mutation that was so amazingly beneficial, and then you end up with a platypus, right? Which apparently survives, 100,000 times better than whatever ancestor it was. There was 100,000 mutations previously to it. But when we just look at it, that's just ridiculous, right? Most all the animals that we observe survive just about the same, right? Same with trees and plants and so forth. They're all still just going fine, right? Major, massive environmental changes can wipe something out. And then if we were to try to perform actual judgments or experiments where scientists had to name which organism is hundreds of thousands or at least thousands of times better at surviving than some other one because it came after, right? And it's the result of a wipeout after wipeout of mutation that bestowed such a strong survival advantage that it wiped out the previous gene pool. And the reason it has to wipe it out, remember, is because if it doesn't, if it's mainly neutral, then you're stuck with a very tiny pool of of monkeys or proto-platypuses where the next mutation can happen, right? You can't have a mutation happen in a different population. It has to happen in an organism that already has the mutation on the way to getting where you're trying to get to. And this is where local peak theory, and this is kind of the final thing I'll say about evolution, this is where local peak theory helps us make sense of things. What actually we observe, what actually we would suppose theoretically, and what we actually do observe everywhere we look in nature, is that all the different species are basically stuck on local peaks. Yeah, you can have a bit of a shift where there's some differences that happen from environmental changes, or there's some birds that span the globe and change as they go, and so forth. But what you basically have are what natural selection works against, just like trying to walk down a local peak, right? If you're on a mountain range and you're trying to get higher, if you can't see the mountain range, you can only see a little bit because there's a fog, or it's a vast mountain range. Or this is of course a non-conscious process, right? Evolution is supposed to be. I'm not saying it is, but the theory says it is. Then you have to like program a robot, or you can't even program it, right? But anyhow, basically what happens is that each species gets selected for stability. If you invert the local peak theory, it's the exact same theory. It's just a different way to picture it. To have local basins, then when something gets to the bottom, it's easy to picture because of gravity for that reason. Then gravity will take like water or something to the bottom of a local basin, right? Like if you have a basin somewhere else, if you have a basin and then it along the sides it goes up, of course, right? And then if somewhere far away it went even lower, then if water could or anything, a ball or whatever, a little ball bearing or something, could go all the way up, and then went somewhere else to another basin that was lower, then it can get to a lower spot. But mostly, each basin will kind of protect itself, right? Like if a ball bearing or some water gets to the bottom of a particular local basin, it'll tend to stay there, and the walls will act against it. And that's what you see with species. And that's what we can see with people and their conceptual boxes, right? You get comfortable with wherever you're at in life, and that tends to work against you getting somewhere else, right? There isn't like a force driving you just because there's a better peak somewhere else. Non-conscious processes are going to tend to keep you where you're at, right? And that's natural selection, chance, whatever, or just the way nature works by default. It tends to keep species where they're at, right? If a dog has mutations, those will tend to wash out, or they'll just sit there neutrally in the population here and there. But if it's neutral, fine. But if it's changing from being a normal dog, or we think of as a normal dog, then that's going to work against it generally. Okay, that was a lot of talk about evolution, but that provided a lot of what you guys asked about examples and me kind of thinking with you and walking through things. The conclusion is not to feel superior to people that believe in evolution or anything, but it's again another kind of metaphorical firewalk or breaking through a board, where if someone believes in evolution, then we can know that their ability to think clearly at least isn't being used in that field. If it is their major career or field, then that's one thing. But it's just another example of how the thinking of people is something's really off, right? Something's really going wrong with people's default thinking. And it's not even close. Like evolutionary theory is patently ridiculous. If someone actually believed what I just said, like the way that evolutionists believe in evolutionary theories, they keep it real blurry for themselves. But if someone actually believed, oh yeah, then you'd think that they were actually insane, right? Like, oh yeah, what happened was you had a population of the monkeys, and then there was a little mutation in one of their proteins, and then that happened, and that happened 100,000 times, where either each new mutation happened in 1/1000th the same monkey, all the way to being a human for basically no reason. Which even if that did happen, that contradicts the theory itself, which says natural selection has to drive it. If someone's saying that each of those mutations actually made it better at surviving, now it has to take over the gene pool, either fully or mostly, right? 100,000 times that had to happen, leaving no fossil evidence except for like one proto whale somewhere that had like a something that looks like a leg, right? But even monkeys to humans, you'd need a million different populations that would leave some residue, and plus you wouldn't have the original population. That very theory says the original population is 100,000 worst survival steps from wherever it evolved to, right? But we have this scheme of that again. I affirm that first you had single-celled organisms, then you had multi-celled organisms, but we still have those same single-celled organisms that were been around for 3 billion years. So if they were so terrible at surviving that they had to evolve, right, to oak trees and mammals and reptiles and so forth, then why are they still here, right? Their population didn't get wiped out along the way, so that didn't happen. So again, it just makes no sense anywhere you look. And then if you look at the prebiotic soup, the idea of life originating from non-life, that also just goes against science. You don't have macromolecules like proteins and DNA and RNA coming together in water. The chemistry says the opposite. Basic chemistry that every lay chemistry student and every professor knows. You don't get large molecules like that coming together in water. They break down in water. So everywhere you look, it's just utter nonsense. And yet people believe it, and they believe it in a condescending way. Like, Bill Maher, right? He's a good example, right? He's like, he couldn't be more condescending towards people that are religious and so forth. And yeah, you could do interviews and get people who believe in God to say dumb things too. Don't get me wrong, of course, plenty of that. But really, like all over the world, people just don't even come close to thinking straight. Like people implicitly believe what I just said actually happened, right? With the monkeys and everything, and leaving no trace, and leaving the original population of monkeys. Like it's just mind-boggling. And that there's such a thing as 100,000 mutations, each of which, again, helps survival. So, okay, that was a whole hour on that. But I will see what we have here in our talking. We've got a lot of Brain FM talking. See, here's the thing, Chris. It's not that evolutionary. See, then when you look at the people arguing against evolutionary theory, I got started on this by talking about the book Not a Chance. See, here's the thing, is when you look at the people arguing for either creation or intelligent design, they say stuff like, well, intelligent design or creationism, it's just a theory, but so is evolution. And they'll say things like evolution can't be proven. No, evolutionary theory can be proven to be absolutely wrong. And that's what the book Not a Chance helped me with, because something was clearly wrong. First of all, these two camps just kept talking past each other. They didn't seem to realize that there's no point to any of this discussion if you're talking past each other. I realized we had to change the game. We had to find something deeper, a playing field that we could all talk on. So wherever we're coming from, right, and presumably plenty of people that are listening are coming, or I presume, maybe not, but are coming from a place where they do think that evolutionary theory is correct. But what I've built with us together is a deeper playing field where we can just talk and think, that we're just not talking past each other. And it's not true that evolutionary theory is unlikely. It's fully not correct. What I outline with the monkeys and other ways, it's just absurd. It can't be correct. No one can. No one actually believes that once they think it, like once they zoom in on it properly and look at it. Just like no one would actually affirm, depending on how clearly they saw it. Like someone could argue with me, but if they did, they would have to change what I'm saying a little bit to make it unclear. So on. But like violence can't actually educate people, right? Like having that as the foundation for educating children just really doesn't make a lot of sense. If I'm looking at a baseball bat thinking, man, this could really make the world better if I just bash enough, heads, then that would only be true if I was bashing, people that were bashing other people. But anyway, that's kind of a random statement. But But what got me looking and what was so exciting about the law of non-contradiction was it gave me something to start with, to try to figure out what the heck is going on. Why are the people arguing against evolutionary theory, arguing for intelligent design or creation? What they're saying is not totally solid. Like like the argument, like I knew there had to be, or I intuited or something, that there had to be something, some way to find where evolutionary theory wasn't just improbable, it was impossible. Let me give you one other thing. They talk about how a monkey on a typewriter would eventually type out Shakespeare's Hamlet. But that's not true, that's the case, especially once you start applying it to anything that would be substantial or make any sense. I realize this is changing it a little bit, but first of all, it would never be the case that a monkey would type out Hamlet and then stop and then say, oh, I've typed out Hamlet, and then hand it to you, first of all. But humans can actually do that, by the way. According to evolutionary theory, you actually do have the case in real life that purely from evolution, someone did type out Hamlet, say, okay, I've now typed out Hamlet, it's Hamlet, and I'm done. Do you see what I'm saying? Evolutionary theory actually says that evolution itself, all by itself, can make that happen, because evolutionists believe that evolution created everything, right? That evolution is an actual like thing that can do stuff. And we have something totally different. Once you see the world from a consciousness field, then things change, right? You stop trying to build the whole world out of the physical world, which isn't foundational, and that we have no direct interaction with or experience with, right? We only directly interact with our consciousness field. So anything we build has to come from that. But this book, where it pointed out, what R.C. Sproul did was he pointed out that chance is no thing. It doesn't exist as such. It's just an expression it's like a subjective expression of ignorance. Like there's such a thing as a result being random from my point of view, right? As a limitation of my knowledge. There's such a thing as a coin flip being random from my point of view. But chance doesn't make a coin land heads or tails, is what he's pointing out. Chance isn't something that can go do stuff. Chance certainly can't create the entire world. He's saying it's nothing. He said that this book is a diatribe against chance, is how he described it. But in doing so, he just laid out the law of non-contradiction, which goes back to Aristotle, right? And presumably before that even. But it's just the idea that something and its opposite can't both be true at the same time in the same relationship. Once I discovered that, then it led to so much for me. The talk on evolution kind of, in a sense, stands on its own. But somehow there's something about me just kind of walking through it with you that I wanted to do. So, all right, let me. But I realize that might just be fairly bizarre that I spent an hour doing that. Al Gore. So John asks, okay, no evolution happened. So how did all the multitudinous species, including us, get here? Okay. What we can understand is that non-conscious processes can't. Okay. So I have a slide here. Let me find it. All right. I use the law of non-contradiction to pretty much fully replace willpower, and also narrow down the gray area for intuition and other things like that, approximation, and me just trying to push and make things happen to work inside it. There's plenty of times when we don't know the answer. I'm just going to give you, I'll go straight to an example here. When we talk about who we are, one of the things that kept pushing me to try to figure things out about who we really are was just realizing that um, that what just making sure I didn't equivocate or what the word change means. Like if I just understand that if something changes, it's not the same thing. And what I did was I stuck with that. The thing with the law of non-contradiction is that people don't actually use it. It's not complicated. And maybe that is part of intuitively my point for going through evolutionary theory as I just did. Evolutionary theory is so ridiculous. That's the fascinating thing about it. It's just beyond ridiculously absurd. It shouldn't be given our normal worldview, where people basically are not like fully insane, right? Like, don't we have a worldview where we meet our neighbor, right? We don't think of them as like a raging psychopath or fully belongs in a insane asylum. But evolutionary theory is so ridiculous. And yet, people who we think of as normal people believe it. And I'm not saying, again, it's not about judging or being condescending, but we need to get over, there's something really deep, simple but deep, that you and I, but still need to get over. And that is we have so much overconfidence that the way things seem is basically how they are. Anyone who believes in evolutionary theory, right? Like they have to believe in what I just said about the monkeys. They have to affirm that bacteria evolved into an oak tree because oak trees have more grandkids than bacteria. But they just don't, right? Bacteria have so many more grandkids than oak trees. And bacteria still survive to this day. So oak trees can't be better at surviving than bacteria because bacteria are fully able to survive. An individual bacteria might not live that long, but bacteria as a species or as a whole, they still survive. So if you survive, right? Period. Like by definition, you're fully good at it. Does that make sense? And then if you go by the more grandkids thing, the more offspring, bacteria are better than oak trees. And yet, so anyone who believes in evolution has to believe both that it's survival of the fittest, but fittest means more grandkids. There's as soon as they try to come up with a different if an evolutionist tries to deny that, they go nowhere, right? It means you live and don't die out, but that you have to produce offspring, right? Like clearly you're not evolutionarily fit if you don't produce any offspring, obviously, right? You see that? And then if your offspring produce offspring and more of it than some other guy that looks like you, then you're more evolutionary fit, right? More grandkids. But this is why it matters, and this really matters. Remember that fundamentally one of the big things I'm doing for you in alchemy is I'm showing you things that don't seem important, and showing you that they're, and I'm at least asserting, and then hopefully showing you how these things are very, very important. That puts me in a bind, and it's working out great with you guys, but it puts me in a bind because think about what I just said. I'm showing you where things that don't seem important to people are actually very important. That means each new thing I talk about will start out seeming unimportant in most cases, unless I do a really good job at making it seem important within the first couple seconds, which I sometimes do, but often don't, perhaps. Do you see? So everything's going to seem not important over and over again that I talk about. And I only kind of fully succeed with you if I can make you or help you. But then I don't even want to say make you, right? If I can give you enough that you can run that you can and do run with it the rest of the way until the stuff I talk about, and I don't talk about that much stuff, right? Seems important. Even evolution itself, because of its real world impact, it all by itself, it can shatter this thing, this massive block that we have. It's such a massive block. You see, we don't think that like we and basically everyone else is like full on just freaking ridiculously insane. Because it seems like people aren't because of standards and norms. But we really need to get to the point where we embrace that, including in ourselves, that unless we break out, and maybe you already have, but make damn sure you have. Because if you were still thinking that people before this talk, if you were thinking that, if think of anyone you know that believes in evolution, if you were thinking that person wasn't totally nuts, where they shouldn't even be able to like tie their freaking shoelaces, but they can, I get that, right? But thinking that an oak tree has more grandkids than like a bacteria is just bizarre. Especially oak trees, as a whole, right? Um, or cicadas. Cicadas, what do they? Don't they go into the ground for like 17 years? And they don't reproduce that entire time. Does that seem like a great way to have more grandkids than you? Is to just not reproduce for 17 years? So somehow that evolved from natural selection. It doesn't make any sense, right? The thing I went through about monkeys, you have to be crazy. And then I was talking about, and I'm not accusing people of being crazy. I'm saying, what I'm saying is that it's necessarily true that people are crazy, right? If people believe these kinds of things, it violates our view of the world. Like we have to stop thinking that anything about the normal way of thinking and about how well people can think is close to okay. As long as we think that, where's the incentive for breaking out and thinking clearly and using the law of non-contradiction? Lots of people learn this. I didn't learn it, so maybe a lot of people don't learn it. But I mean, I didn't learn it until I was like in my 20s. Um, I learned symbolic logic when I was in 7th grade, but somehow I didn't connect the dots up to this. But something's really, really wrong. And these people are like teaching at universities, believing this stuff. And remember, it's not just a monkey. I could sit here for the next 10 years giving new examples of absolutely ridiculous scenarios that have to be the case for evolution. Because the law of non-contradiction is so easy and simple, but it just feels like it's just not necessary to use because we feel like, well, people just basically have life figured out decently to some degree. And they just don't. It's not only evolution, but evolution stands on its own. Because even if it was only evolution, to believe in things that ridiculous it just doesn't conform to our worldview. Like like if another example is I re, I re, like if your neighbor believed, this isn't the best example that I can come up with. If they believed that like every day unicorns dug up their lawn and replanted the grass and then it regrew the next day, and they said that to you and they really believed it, they weren't kidding, then just from that one thing you would think there was something off about them. Do you see what I mean? And that's true, isn't that true? So if that's the case, if one absolutely ridiculous belief someone holds like strong, like even if they think that it's highly plausible that unicorns dig up all their grass in their lawn, replant it, and the grass grows each new day. If they thought that was totally plausible, um, there would have to be something off about them, right? You see what I mean? And you yourself would probably believe that. So if you believe that, then you have to believe it if they the same thing if they believe what I just went through about the monkeys or anything else with evolution, or about making single-celled organisms like cells that survive in the prebiotic soup in like the oceans. That is so beyond ridiculous. It's more ridiculous than the monkeys if you get into the details, and I won't. That'd be another few hours. But it's so ridiculous. At least the unicorns is possible. Digging up the grass and replanting. And also keep in mind that evolution ends up forming a psychological underpinning for many actual violent ideologies, right? Um, uh, it and pretty much, yeah. I mean, it undergirds so much of government too, and it's used as an excuse for violence. I realize people say religion is used as an excuse for violence as well. Okay. Um, John asked, and this isn't really about evolution, but just to explain, we don't need to know how the species got here. If we know that they couldn't get here from evolution, then we know they couldn't get here from evolution. Do you see? Um, Karen, I originally got started on this whole thing that developed in the law of implication and understanding how the mind works and how people think, and excuse me, developing OMG. It all started with me working on a book on evolution for years. That was actually what I was working on when I came across the deeper stuff about how to know what's true, and as I said, law of implication and everything. That all came out of, I originally called it like the method of I realized that the fundamental problem was people didn't know how to know what's true. Not that they were getting evolution wrong, but that there was something deeper. Because people weren't, here's the thing. There's a couple things, sorry. I know I'm saying, what was going on, and what I'm about to say here is critical. What was going on is people were talking as if they all knew how to know what's true. The creationists, the intelligent design people, the evolutionists, but they would never discuss what the method of how to know what's true first. So they wouldn't get together and say, here's the method of how to know what's true. Let's be clear about this. Let's all get it. We got that first? Good. Now let's talk about evolution or creation or intelligent design. That's the craziness, right? That people live their lives as if they already know how to know what's true, right? And that's the whole starter kit I'm telling you about. In order to get you surviving, your brain develops a method of making something feel real and foundational and making stuff feel true, even when it doesn't know. It just absorbs inputs. It doesn't really know anything in a certain sense, your brain. And then we proceed from there. So it's the height of insanity. And evolution is just an example of the bottom line full-on, until you face the full-on insanity. And I often don't talk this way, but we're like 18, right? This is what, the 18th, 17th or 18th one. I could scroll up and find out. 18. I often don't talk this way, but it needs to be said at some point. You need to embrace the full-on absolute insanity of not getting how to know what's true straight in life and then acting as if it's all straight. That's the fundamental insanity. But until you embrace that everyone's basically crazy or the equivalent of a drug addict, and then people ask me sometimes, well, what can LOI do? Not people in alchemy, but people, thinking about listening to it. What does LOI do for you? And it's just, in practice, it's the same thing as a drug addict asking, well, what would it do for me if I get off drugs? Right? But someone who just feels like it all makes sense to take drugs and they're totally into it and everything like that. Because our brain basically drugs us, right? It basically drugs us into thinking we know what's true, right? Quite what I'm saying is pretty much literally true, right? It makes you feel with brain chemicals, which is what drugs stimulate, right? That you know what's true already. So it drugs you into insanity, into the height of insanity. So everyone is basically their starter kit. They're basically just a full-on drug addict on a drug that's making them feel like they know what's true when they have no idea how to know. It's not that people don't know what's true. It's that they don't know how to know what's true, and they don't realize how much that matters, right? Knowing what's true takes a method. You can't just will it directly. If you could will directly to know what's true, then people wouldn't get anything wrong. Another angle on the very core thing in life, and this relates to reminds me of Rick's old great question, where he outlined the method, the main goal achieving method of make it challenging, make it greater than yourself, visualize it in the now, and step-by-step method. That's all correct, but it's correct based on the assumption that essentially the way things seem is the same as the way things are. And what I just said will bear you thinking about it. I'll elaborate on it a little bit, but that's a massive hint. And just to address the two, John Ferguson and John Sesko, for a moment, and I'll get back to what I just said. We don't need to know what happened to know. This is the great thing about the law. This is the whole beauty of the law of non-contradiction. I don't need to know who I am to understand that whatever it is that I am, it can't be something that changes. Because if I don't contradict or to equivocate, to change the meaning of a word is to contradict the original meaning. If I change the meaning of a word, it means I got rid of the previous meaning and I have a new meaning. They're not the same. To say they're the same is to contradict myself. To say that the two things are the same when they're not the same. If I say it changes, it must be the case that it's not the same. It is not the same. What's the opposite of it is not the same? It is the same. It is the same, it is not the same. Exactly one of those has to be true about any particular two things. Exactly one. When you have the word not right in front of a statement, exactly one of them has to be true. And so if I were to say that I change, then I've already contradicted myself, because inherent within I is I'm also saying that I'm using the same word to refer to the thing before I supposedly changed and after I changed. So I'm using the same word to refer to something that I must be different, because the word change means something's different, right? So there was an I that I'm referring to previously. It changed, and to change means to change into something not the same. And then if someone, so whenever someone says I changed, which happens plenty, and I might say it in conversation because we have to just talk at some point, but you can understand that I don't mean it in the wrong sense. If someone thinks of themselves as identifies anything that can change, they're wrong. Now you can identify like in the terms of role playing, like you can identify with a character in a video game, you can identify with yourself, like your physical body and mind, where it's like stipulating, where you're saying, okay, I'm going to identify with this for the time being. But I understand it's not me fundamentally. It's not when I talk about I. When I talk about myself, I'm referring whatever the word myself is referring to, it has to be some kind of frame that doesn't change. And then if the contents can change. But what I did was I stuck with it, and I didn't know. That's why this took me so many years, decades. Is because you start by saying it can't be here, it can't be over there. So the answer is somewhere over here. So we can understand that evolutionary theory as a creation mechanism is false. Without proposing an alternative theory. And then we can build how do we do anything? We start to build on what we know, right? And then the truth may or may not fill itself in over time. But some truth fills itself in because we're building what we know. When you build things in the proper way, I went straight to the correct view of the world early on in alchemy, where we understand we base things in our consciousness field, we base who we are as building off of that, right? We define words by constructing them off of things in our consciousness field, or off of things referring to things in our consciousness field. So the consciousness field itself, the thing that's aware of it is me. Since I keep referring to myself, I can't change, right? Or I need to come up with a different word or reference or name for myself every time I changed. I wouldn't be the same thing. I would die, be gone, and replaced by something else. So then I had to figure out what else I was, but you just start by not contradicting yourself. Our mind isn't built this way by default. Our mind goes straight to, well, what's the right answer, right? And school doesn't originate this, but it reinforces it. It's like this feedback loop that further solidifies the wrong answer very powerfully. So by the time we're at an age where we could begin to think about things properly and developing first our method of knowing what's true and then developing other things off of that, then the wrong understanding of the world has been so powerfully reinforced that people don't think about it. I have no problem saying that someone who actually believed that about monkeys, that actually happened, I have no problem saying that such a person would have to be like insane. They'd have to have no grip on reality. I'm comfortable saying that. And then you could say, well, David, did you just say that everyone who believes in evolution has no grip on reality? Well, what are you going to deny? Like, if someone has an issue with me saying that, they're just associating. They're just saying, well, you can't say that. But which of the building blocks are wrong? Does someone really want to affirm any of those schemes about monkeys developing into humans? Or does someone really want to affirm each of the details about what it would take in order to make a viable cell that could replicate and survive in a prebiotic soup that's being irradiated all the time? It's like if you have a, yeah, I mean, does someone want to affirm so a monkey on a typewriter will type Hamlet eventually? Really? Really? How about, will it run out of ink, maybe? Think like even just the basic thoughts about this once you use alchemy, once you actually picture the scenario. So you have a monkey on a typewriter, it's going to type Hamlet. No, it's not. It's going to starve to death, for goodness sakes. How simple is this? It's going to run out of ink, it's going to run out of paper, and it's going to starve to death. And plus, where do you get any of these things? Evolutionary theory starts with nothing, right? And then it tries to get everything else. So if you start with an empty room, is a monkey going to type Hamlet? There's no monkey, there's no typewriter. But then even if you start with a monkey and a typewriter, it runs out of ink, it starves to death, right? Why would it even type? Right? Maybe it'll type for a few seconds and then stop typing. Do you see it? Even just these go-to metaphors or illustrations, it just makes no sense if you just think about it for a little bit. So these people that affirm that a monkey on a typewriter will eventually type Hamlet, no, it won't. And if it does, it'll drive out of San Francisco. Like I said, it'll keep on typing after Hamlet. So what are you doing with all this extra paper? Nothing's happening to it, right? Even if you get an RNA molecule in a prebiotic soup, it'll break apart. It won't get bigger and bigger and bigger and meet up with dozens or hundreds of other RNA molecules and then get surrounded by a cell membrane and then merge with proteins and amino acids. None of those exist in a prebiotic soup. Even the building blocks they start with aren't the actual building blocks we measure that were there. Scientists just start with them because they have to be there to make the theory work in the first place, even to have any, there's still no chance, but even scientists aren't so ridiculous, even evolutionists, I should say, aren't so ridiculous as to say, if you had water with absolutely nothing but water, then you eventually get a cell. They at least have to say, look, you have to have nitrogen molecule, or if you have like an early atmosphere with nothing but hydrogen, then they don't say that you get a molecule or a living cell somehow out of that. So they have to at least start with like nitrogen and water and whatever else. Carbon dioxide probably. I don't even know how you do it. Carbon dioxide is so stable. Once carbon dioxide turns into carbon dioxide, it doesn't. It's one of the most stable molecules. Same with nitrogen and so forth. It's just so bizarre, and yet people believe it. So how do they do it? How do people do what I'm calling insane? Blurriness, right? They just don't think it through. You see? So what else aren't people thinking through is my point, right? How about sending your kid to school, right? How does it make sense? We just don't think it through. Or how about at least the idea that violence and extortion and so forth can lead to educating kids in a way that's going to make them better citizens. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Certainly with violence, you can maybe in a simple way imagine educating people, right? You put a grammar book in front of a kid, and if they don't pass a test, you smash them in the kneecap. And then presumably the next time you put the book in front of them, they might take it more seriously. So I realize how someone could say, well, how about that? However, generally people wouldn't affirm that in the first place, right? And we think they were crazy if they suggested that. But at least you could maybe make sense of it. But then if we said, well, that's going to make someone into a good citizen or help them, be a free-thinking person, maybe it would make them even a good citizen if we imagine a good citizen being a compliant person. Maybe we could even imagine that violence could do that. But if we think about our own children, is that what we, is that what we want? I don't know. Probably not. Do we really want people that are comfortable being paid from extortion, being the role models, or being the person that our kid is exposed to and learning from and being told what's true? Not me. But what keeps it blurriness, and what keeps blurriness trying to have things fit into our worldview because we want to achieve our goals, right? Your foundation has to feel solid for you to move forward in practice. So then the question is importance. Is it important to take a look at your foundation? Will it really help because of the cost benefit of it? Or should we just suppose that our foundation is fine? But if people can believe stuff like evolution, then is our thinking straight? So again, we don't need to know the right answer to things. That's the point. That's why the law of non-contradiction is actually so helpful. It seems unimportant if we just need the answer. That's why looking at the opposite doesn't seem helpful. If we're trying to build on what we know, then the law of non-contradiction can be golden. Because in practice, everybody has a view of themselves, and I'm not including necessarily people in alchemy or not, because we've been talking about this stuff to some degree, but doesn't every person in normal life have a view of themselves that they identify with? They'll say, this is me, and they'll affirm that they can change. But that's an inherent contradiction. So one of the most fundamental beliefs people have about themselves is it has to be wrong. All they have to do is have the law of non-contradiction, and they could realize that, and if they just stuck with it, then they would start looking somewhere else. Everyone's looking in the wrong place. So you see, someone could think theoretically, well, but why do I need the law of non-contradiction? Because maybe I'm looking in the right place anyway. So just knowing the opposite isn't true. Like if I'm trying to make money by ranking websites and making a web business work, then how's the law of non-contradiction supposed to help me? Because I'm already maybe looking in the right place. Well, it can help you, all kinds of ways. But just going back to the thing about who you are as a person, that gets alchemized with everything you do, right? Your self-image and there's the self you identify with, and then separately who you believe you really are, which can be two different things. But people in practice mush them together anyway. So a person's idea of themselves gets mixed with all their communications, all their attempts at making money, plus their relationships, which impact their making money and everything. Both direct business relationships and supportive social relationships, all of it. Plus your understanding of you and your ability to control your mind. People have a great difficulty with their own minds because they identify with their mind. If you identify with your mind, for your mind to change is death, right? I might have mentioned that before. And especially for any foundational stuff to change, you can't move forward. You're blocked. You feel blocked, right? If you feel like your foundation isn't solid, then you don't feel like moving forward. Your mind doesn't like that because it wants to go after a goal that's currently going after. So it needs you to not look at your foundation because it calculates that will impede your ability to progress. But if your foundation is screwed up, then you need to get your foundation straight. Your reality is going to keep catching up with you and kicking you in the wherever, depending on your gender and so forth. So try to tie together some of these threads here. So when it comes to the law of non-contradiction, at least with our idea of ourself, everyone's looking in the wrong place. Everyone you know is looking in the wrong place, and they're not looking anywhere else. They're looking at things that can change. All they would need is the law of non-contradiction and realize that if something changes, it can't be the same thing, and then realize that they're talking as if they are the same thing, and that's a contradiction, and they would look somewhere else. If they started to apply that to all their words, see, I noticed that what I thought all of my words referred to, I couldn't make any sense of it. There's myself, and then there's, what a dog is, or who's my mom? What if I picture my mom in my head? Is that my mom? No. If it changes, but I keep calling my mom my mom. But then if it refers to different things, or if my mom can change, that doesn't make sense either. So my mom has to be, I'm still talking about people here. But I talked about concepts or objects. I talked about in previous webinar, a few webinars ago, I think when I was talking about mismatching or starting to talk about how to know what's true, I said, well, is the road in front of your house, is it gray? Well, gray is something that only is a type of thing that exists in your consciousness field. So now the word road has to refer to something that at least exists in your consciousness field. But then if I were to ask somebody, if you close your eyes, does the road outside your house still exist? And they would say yes. Well, it's not in their conscious field now for sure, right? And when they say it exists, so now they're affirming that it's not in their conscious field. And then someone might say, well, maybe the road is partly in your conscious field, partly not. But the problem is that a part doesn't equal a whole either. So 99% of something is not the same as something. A pie with a slice taken out is not the same as the whole pie. So if someone says, well, maybe the road, that whatever the road refers to or that concept, maybe it partly exists in my conscious field and partly exists out there. Well, okay, but when I said, is the road gray, you didn't say, well, one part of it is gray. Or we didn't say part of it is still exists when I close my eyes and part doesn't. So is it a part or is it the whole? And so what the law of non-contradiction does is it kicks us out of looking in the wrong place. It doesn't give us the answer unless it's very simple. Sometimes it does give us the answer immediately, but that's why it seems unimportant. That's why it seems, but I'm giving you plenty of answers separately in alchemy, but today, and this kind of helps explain the evolution thing also, and what the feeling was that I had about it. Today is about getting you away, and the law of non-contradiction is about the use of it, is getting you away from looking in the wrong place. And constantly you are looking in the wrong place. And how do I know that? Because at least outside of alchemy, everyone's identifying their self as something that can change. And who they are is something that can change. So if you're looking in the wrong place about your basic identity, then obviously it's not, we can at least guess pretty strongly that that's not the only thing we have wrong. And even if it was, that's pretty bad, right? And then also they're looking in the wrong place about how to know what's true. They're looking to their mind to find out what's true. They're looking for a sense of certainty from their mind to find out what's true. Well, that can't be where knowing comes from. And I realize I didn't complete that thought, but I may or may not explain that in this webinar about how it can't possibly be that knowing can come from our mind. And let's look at this other central concept that I mentioned it, but now let me get back to it more clearly. See, the only thing blocking you from getting the full benefit of alchemy, if anything, again, it comes down to this law of non-contradiction idea. It comes down to there's places where fundamentally you're waffling between looking in the right place and the wrong place. I'm about to get to the concept I said was important in a moment, but we can see this in a practical way with thinking about working for yourself or creating an income outside of a job that you might have. You can just ask yourself, do I want to only have my income be dependent on a job for the rest of my life? And the answer could be yes, but presumably, you guys, it's no. And you could say, well, do I know for sure that that really isn't the best thing for me? No, you don't have to, but you can look at the situation, and remember, we just need to hit a big target. It can be fairly clear. There's a whole number of things you can't have in life if you're tied to a job, right? The amount of time you could spend with your kids is greatly limited. The amount of time you could spend thinking about how to think straight is perhaps limited. Your income is very capped, right? Your retirement, the amount, like it can be, depending on your job, it can be fairly tough to actually retire without depending on at least government or whatever. So both with time and the amount of money you might want, and it could be pretty restricted. And there's a certain sense of hope, right, that you can't have sticking within your job. So if you know that you can't get there within a job, then that crosses that off, and then you don't have to waffle about it, right? You can based on some things you can know, you can say, I'm comfortable stipulating a job isn't enough. And now, when you're sure about that, you won't ever go back to looking there and thinking, well, maybe then it's just, look, I've got to make something work. regarding monetization of my own outside of a job. Got to make something work. And then we can also we can realize that absolutely anything you do to make something work outside of a job, the business, you might not have to provide all these three things if you team up with people, but the business has to get traffic, it has to have a product, and it has to have some kind of conversion mechanism, and that's it. And so you can feel very comfortable that traffic is, a big useful thing. And then you could say, well, is it possible to have a business work without prospects, without potential leads? Basically, no. You can have one, in some cases, you can get so successful that the leads come in like kind of effortlessly. So it can kind of look like that on the surface. But one way or the other, they're coming in. Or at least you got enough in that now, just by retaining the people you have, maybe it's ongoing forever somehow. But that's, you still have to get them in the first place. And it's unlike, we can acknowledge that and move on. Right? And so you cross off these things and then it becomes simpler. That's why I say I use it to replace willpower. Because if I'm thinking, look, maybe I should get to work or maybe I should do this project, I can generally see, first of all, how if I don't take any action on that project, am I going to, what's the world going to be like? No, I definitely don't want that, right? If I don't get out and network, then can I possibly get clients? Maybe you can, but at least some form of getting, new leads or something like networking. Or you could say, look, aren't I going to have more clients faster? Potentially, if I network, isn't that a very reasonable place to look? Do I want to just cross that off? No, I don't want to cross that off. I don't want to cross off the potential benefits of that. It's clearly a reasonable place to look. So I'm going to stop questioning that for now. And then you might not know exactly how to go about it best, but you're clear that the opposite isn't where you want to be. Totally crossing off networking. And so you don't know exactly the details of the right answer, but you want to be networking because you've crossed off the idea of not networking. So you've totally crossed it off. You don't need willpower. And then you just you keep proceeding from there. But in practice, I figured all this stuff out and then went on to become a multimillionaire by just identifying, like, that's how I build what I know generally. Sometimes like the exact correct answer fills itself in and then you're just like, okay, good, and just go do it or grab it or have it or whatever. But along the way, you keep crossing off the opposite. Right? You can figure out who you are. You can figure out the right answer or enough of the right answer about how we came about without evolution by just not believing that the answer is in places where it can't be. Evolution's ridiculous for far more reasons than I even just said, right? You have to believe that physical forces and matter and energy are fundamental, are self-existent. But they exist only as reasons for why you experience what you experience in your conscious field or why other people experience. That's their entire existence. They're not foundational. Gravity doesn't do anything. When you see things properly, it's just absurd. Like gravity gets up and does stuff. Just come on. The idea that like forces exist in and of themselves is just gets to be silly once you look at it the right way. Those are the people that believe in magic. Like gravity's like magic. Like, okay, there are these two objects and they just like attract each other. All right. Or there's a positive and negative charge. There's nothing in between and they just attract each other. Yeah, of course that's how the physical world works. But to think that's foundational, that's the bottom of it, is just plain silly, right? Much like thinking that the pixels on your computer screen, right? Again, it's literally the same as thinking that a picture of a magnet on your computer screen, a positive or two magnets on a computer screen, that they're attracting each other through the force of electromagnetism. on the pixels on your computer screen. That's how silly it is to believe that about real life, right? Of course, if you're playing a game that has magnets and you have to attach them together, and that's like some kind of Tetris-like game or something where normal magnetism seems to function in the game, then of course within the model of the game and the programmer programmed it so that there is like the equivalent of a force, right? That's how it's programmed. That's the same way real life works too. If that's programmed into the game, then it's programmed into the game. Then it works within the context of the game. But to think that there's actual magnetism taking place in the sense that people think of it is just silly. It's just a regularity within the code or programmed into the code of the physical world. The code's doing it, not magnetism itself. Magnetism is just a model projected on the code, just to kind of picture it tangibly. Okay, but there's still a point I want to continue to get to that's related to all this. I want to point out, people ask me also, what do you mean by bottlenecks, right? And of course I've given examples, but, and I started to refer to this when I talked about the standard scheme of achieving goals. It overlooks that in one angle, it's your fundamental bottleneck in life, which is the world could be, your existence could be one of two ways. The way that things seem could really be the way that they are, like all the time. Meaning that you would feel like, oh, if I do this, that's going to benefit me. If I sleep with this woman, then that's going to make my life better, right? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, right? The ripple effect, like you know, if I go chase after this money-making scheme that sounds really good, that's going to make my life better. If I ignore some tasks that are niggling at me, then I'd prefer to do that. I don't want to do those tasks, someone might say. But what does want mean? Want can mean one of two things. Want could mean just identifying the feeling that you currently have. But when someone says, I don't want to do a task, they don't mean that they're identifying a feeling. They mean that it inherently means that in the future, like it's basically somehow worse if they do that task, right? Like, and people basically affirm a contradiction at the same time, right? People kind of have a contradictory thought all the time about, I don't want to do such and such, but it's something that they also think would make them better off if they did. Well, which is it? Are you better off if you did, or are you worse off? Because if I don't want is just identifying a feeling, you're also projecting that feeling into the future. But you don't know what's in the future. All you know, what you know better is that you want that task done. That you know, so focus there. Right? Stipulate it based on seeing it, reasonably clearly and saying, yeah, of course, I'll at least on average be better off if I go take care of this task. So that's why I say focus on what you know. You certainly don't know how you're going to feel while you're doing that task 5 minutes from now. And if you search your memory without confirmation bias, you would find plenty of examples of where you did something you thought you didn't want to do, and you felt better while you're doing it and after. So there's nothing in the future that again, the actual meaning that someone, right, like kind of implicitly means when they say I don't want to do this, means I don't want to do it in the future, not just I feel like I don't want to do it now, but I'm going to love it in the future. That's not what they actually mean, right? But that doesn't make any sense. So is it true or is it not true that how things seem sometimes doesn't match up with how they actually are? That sometimes things that look like they'll progress us towards a goal or look like they'll be a step towards a goal aren't actual steps. Or we feel like we know something, like evolution, seems like or people even, or well, you might not feel this yet, but people who believe in something like evolution, they might seem like people who are generally thinking straight about that sort of thing also, but they can't be. So I'm identifying in one angle like a major bottleneck and game changer that has to be addressed as a major priority in your life. And at least it has to be taken into account. with your priorities and your sense of importance. So normally, whenever you learn about achieving goals, it's correct once you get this issue straight between seems and is, or how things seem being how they actually turn out. So it could be that when we feel absolutely certain about something, then we're just right about it every time. But people act as if that's the case. But is that the case? No. So since how things seem doesn't match up with how they are, including how things seem true, including what will seem to progress us towards our goals, including that a particular objective will actually make us happier or better off. If your vision was constantly deceiving you, then it would be pretty important to figure out a way to deal with that, right? And if there was a way, that it'd be critical to do. And it generally doesn't, right? Generally, our vision functions just fine, and so we really don't have an issue when it comes to visually walking around. Of course, this could be the case with some people, but when it does, and when we get glasses, then we tend to get glasses, right? But generally, that's a kind of another example just to see also further what I'm talking about. It's not really urgent in life that you deal with maybe the tiny differences in how things seem visually with the world and how they are, unless maybe you're doing specific tasks in life. If you're a surgeon and you're not seeing things close up properly, then that could be a real problem that urgently needs to be addressed. But for most of us, it might not matter practically in our daily lives. However, it probably does matter in your daily life, and you don't even know where it's whacking you. That's another thing about going through evolution, is we don't even know where it's messing with us. It seems like professors can at least think a little bit. Like it seems reasonable to send our kids to them. To me, it doesn't. To me, it seems horrifying. Horrifying. The idea of sending my child to college is like a horrifying thought. It's not even like a neutral thought. It's horrifying. The idea that someone who could think such an absolutely insane thoughts. And you have to understand, I question these people. I talk to them. It's not just that they believe in evolution. I would bring up specific, reasonable questions, and I'm telling you, they can't even address them. It's not that they have answers and I'm not satisfied with them. They can't even start to answer. They just go blank. They're just confused if I start to bring it up. They need the blurriness. They need it. Like they're on drugs, like they're zombies. It's bizarre. So I'm talking about this major bottleneck that how things seem to us constantly is not how they actually are, especially including our confidence in our own mind, our confidence in how we're going to feel about something when we go do the task, what goals we should go for, oh my goodness, and what's important. If we, without confirmation bias, take a look at our current life, our life that we're living now, and look in the past, and we go over it, and we think about objectively what would have gotten us ahead in various ways in life and how we spent our time. How well did our mind give us a good sense of importance? Well, if it screwed it up pretty massively until now, then doesn't it make sense to suppose that unless we make a change of some sort, and kind of a major one, right, perhaps, that like it doesn't make any sense to operate now. Like people, most anyone who thinks about how good a job they've done or their mind has done with a sense of importance up till now, they would probably, I mean, I think a lot of people would affirm that it hasn't been very close. And yet, moving forward, people operate as if their sense of importance is like exactly dead on at every minute, don't they? So how things seem doesn't match up even that closely to how things are, especially with our confidence and our sense of importance and so forth, and things like that. So, and our sense of knowing, like we feel like we know all sorts of stuff, but then when we try to figure out what method we use to get to that, it slips through our fingers, like what we did, how we know something. I mean, we can kind of, if it's based on an experience, we can remember the experience. But I mean something like, well, how do you know that in 15 minutes from now you're not gonna be glad you're working on that task that you're saying you don't want to do right now? If you figure out, well, how do you know that? Then it's like, oh, well, I guess I don't. You see, but people say I don't want to do that with full confidence and full certainty, despite the fact that a little bit of reflection would bust that out of the water, right? Blow it out of the water, like I just. So there's a real issue going on with how things seem versus how they are. That has to be dealt with first. The whole scheme of, well, I have to make the goal challenging. Well, how the heck do you even know what's challenging or not? Do you see? That just skips over the fact that something can seem challenging when it isn't challenging. Um, or then I lay out like a step-by-step plan on how to achieve the goal. Well, but often we don't know what the steps are, right? And if we think we do, we're fooling ourselves. Maybe we need to understand a lot more about. We just need maybe to get a lot more understanding before we have any idea what the steps might be. Of course, we can get a sense of what the first semi-soft lock might be, but then, do you see? This is why seeking understanding is so important, because the nature of our existence is such that how things seem doesn't match up with how things are, and it does visually, so it can fool us. But when it comes to certainty, how we're going to feel, what we want to do, our goals, our objectives, what's going to be good strategy, right? What's important, what's going to get us the most bang for our buck. Our minds are totally inadequate at that by default. And so that's why seeking understanding is such an important thing. And that's why we need a method that takes into account that things are going to seem one way and they're going to be totally different when it comes to so much regarding goals. Generally speaking, and it's not like making corrections as you go, getting feedback. Feedback is so incredibly misleading because we have confirmation bias. Plus, it's the fear of feedback is going to drive us crazy, right? And then we can realize that actually what we're going after constantly is two goals at the same time. We're trying to reinforce our self-image while we're trying to achieve some other goal. Or even something so simple. Imagine checking your email. Imagine you hope not to have any emails that are giving you chores to do, right? So you check your email hoping that there's nothing in there. But then at the same time, when you check your email, if there is stuff, then you're gonna have the goal to go do it. So why? But then you're gonna have two active goals. One is to get done with it as soon as possible, right? Clear out your inbox. But then you have two active goals at once: clear out your inbox, and then specifically to address each part, like the person that's sending you the email. Those are two separate things, and they're both active at the same time. And those aren't like perfectly aligned, right? The stuff that might get you, and then to clear out your inbox, what does that exactly mean, right? You can clear out your inbox by basically just deleting your emails and not even looking at them, right? Or giving a quick half-assed answer to people. Or you can address them well. And is addressing the people well, is that going to help get you where you're trying to get to? Very possibly, right? And well might be relative to at least you might sort and filter somewhat. You don't have to do everything that anyone asks you. But don't you want to look at that without confirmation bias, without another goal messing with your head while you're trying to address the email objectively to see to what extent how you want to deal with it best, each one, right? So how things seem, like if you go to your email inbox, and I'm guilty of this, but it helps just to see. But then I realize what's going on, and I had the tools to dissolve it, right? If I come in with the goal of clearing it, and I keep that goal active while I'm addressing emails, then those are two separate things, and they contradict each other. They might not exactly contradict each other, but aspects of them contradict, which is enough, right? It certainly contradicts the idea of addressing the emails most effectively. It takes energy and resources to uphold one goal, right? And then those can't be. Obviously, it's going to reduce your efficiency of the other idea of each individual, looking at each individual email to address it in the way that makes the most sense. So having active goals is going to affect how things seem to you. You see? unless that active goal is to understand about the situation. If I open my email box with the goal of understanding, then that won't conflict with the individual dealing with each individual email. That's why I suggest having your goals be for understanding. Why? Because it deals with the reality. It addresses the fundamental bottleneck we face head on. That's why seeking understanding matters. And it doesn't mean seeking to just fit things, right? Your brain's going to twist understanding. But you need to, by understanding, it means finding, like, using an effective method for distinguishing how things seem from how they really actually are. And sometimes you don't know how they actually are, but at least you can cross off things with the law of non-contradiction. You could say, well, at least they're not this. At least it's not that. If you find yourself saying, I don't want to do this, in a way that implies that the only real meaning that it could imply is that you're not going to want to do it while you're doing it in 15 minutes from now, then you could say, do I really know how I'm going to feel? No, I don't. So I can cross that off. I can stop making statements about it. What do I know? I know that as far as I can tell, I'd rather have that task done than not done. And is there anything clearly wrong with that? No. What am I going to say? What am I going to say? I have no ability to judge tasks that would help clear things out for me. That's ridiculous, right? So I either say I have no ability to do, if I look at especially if I'm looking without like a strong active goal. I'm calm, I'm looking to understand the situation, I'm looking at the task kind of objectively. Am I going to say that when I look at tasks like taking care of some mail that you might have to do or whatever it might be that's kind of maybe niggling at you, but you are putting it off and you feel like you don't want to do it? You either have to say that looking at it in a kind of calm, objective way with some scenarios and so forth, and you could do it in a split second, right? But just kind of looking at it with some clarity, that either has no ability to help shed some light on what to guess, or it does have an ability, and it's ridiculous to say that has no ability. So clearly you can eyeball, and you can also just look historically, right? Is eyeballing tasks, if I look at them kind of a little bit, objectively and calmly and with a seeking understanding, has that been, is that a pretty effective way to judge? Yeah, right? I could judge pretty well if taking care of certain bills or tasks I might have to do or certain things that I'm putting off, if that would be good. That my judgment there is quite reasonable. Seems does equally as when it comes to that stuff pretty well, just in terms of objectively looking at it and thinking, is doing that task going to be helpful? So if I know then that it's reasonable to stipulate that I want to do that task, and then if I realize that my mind's wrong all the time about what I'm going to enjoy doing 15 minutes from now and how I'm going to feel once I'm done, right? Then I've identified things that I know. And then it becomes pretty obvious just to go do the freaking task, right? All right, well, and I'll just summarize with this kind of sentence, is it comes down to when, I was going to say when you're not sure. When there's any sort of red flag, when there's when you're either have a creative situation where you're trying to figure out a solution to get a result that you want, then you can use a law of non-contradiction to cross things off and stick with it. Once you realize something clearly that the answer is not there, then stick with it. Like once I know that whoever and whatever I am, I can't change, then I just stick with it until I get to the answer, or until I get to more stuff that I can know. And in practice, it took me a while to figure out, but I refused to look in the wrong place. Same thing with a job. I refused, like I knew I could tell that the job wasn't going to be the answer for me, or at least not the full answer. And I ended up never having to get a job, but after college. But at least I knew that if it came down to a choice between looking for a job or working for myself, and if I had to choose to work on one or the other, clearly there's no question. It's only like in a vacuum, right? You can see this politically. Just I'm not getting into politics in terms of pushing any point of view right at the moment, but what's ridiculous is when people will talk about one of the candidates in a vacuum, not compared to the other candidate, right? When there's a binary choice. Someone could argue that there's not a binary choice, but then if we at least stipulate that there's a binary choice, then someone will say, oh, I just can't vote for this person because they have this bad quality and that bad quality. Well, not addressing the at least potential binary choice doesn't make much sense. Similarly, if I'm like dejected or feeling like panicked or worried or scared about working for myself, then as soon as I compare it to the alternative, right, alternative use. But my point is that our brain by default actually doesn't do this, right? Like it's a lot. It actually will not compare it to the obvious alternative. Even if it's obvious once you do look at it, your brain still won't be doing it. That's the point of a lot of alchemy is things could be obvious once we take a look at them, but our brain still doesn't do them automatically. So if you're feeling dejected about something regarding creating your own business, stop and compare it with the opposite. What's the alternative? And once you do that, the difference might become clear. And it did for me. Yeah, I definitely want to make it work working for myself, no matter how difficult it might seem. Or if there's a particular person that you're working with who's difficult, well, what's the alternative? Maybe there is, but maybe there isn't. In some cases, when they're taking you in clearly the wrong direction, then the alternative of not moving at all might be better. But if working with them is taking you in basically the right direction, but there's difficulties with it, and you don't have a better plan, and then maybe you stick with them. Make sure you compare with the alternative. Maybe the alternative is better, but maybe it's not. So this idea of the law of non-contradiction also forces you to think more in terms of alternative use. Again, alternative use and the alternative choice is an easy, obvious concept, but in practice it isn't done. Again, it will seem unimportant in a lot of cases, but it is important. Okay, so to summarize, which I've mainly done, but the law of non-contradiction, important because it'll keep you from looking in the wrong place. In practice, people just spend their whole lives looking in the wrong place, like with who they are and so forth. You can also see that, is it the case that even if I feel very confident about certain conclusions, are they always right? No, they're not. So is total confidence or a strong sense of confidence in how I'm going to feel about something or how a person is or whatever, is that a reliable method? Is that the method I want to use to know what's true? No, it doesn't work all the time. I want something that works better. So you use the law of non-contradiction in that way. Instead of, like, I don't need willpower once I look at the alternative and I decide which one I want. A contradiction always has just the word not in front of a sentence. So a job versus working for yourself is not a contradiction. Seeking to get a job versus not seeking to get a job is a contradiction. However, there's still an alternative. Do I stay focused on working for myself only, or do I look for a job? For me. One or the other. If I'm only looking to make $3,000 a month, which is what I started out as, then a job would fully take care of that, presumably. Right? So really, then in that case, it's one or the other once I stipulate that. And if it was just which one I was more afraid of, is working for myself or getting a job, I could judge it, well, I'm more afraid of getting a job. Maybe that's not the best metric, but at least I could see that. And then I don't have to worry about that anymore. So it'll clear up all kinds of places. And once you use the law of non-contradiction on a particular thing, stick with it. Once you realize that you don't know how you're going to feel about doing a task 15 minutes into the future, then remember that. And don't 10 minutes from then just say, oh, I don't want to do this. Wait a second. Do I mean that I know I don't want to do it in the future? Remember that and don't keep walking back into the same thing. But once you see it clearly, and look at it maybe from a few different angles, whatever, try it a few times, it should be kind of easy to do in practice, or stick with an individual thing that you realize. And then the other thing was just when I talked about how this seems versus is issue is your major bottleneck in life, looked at from one angle. So, and people live their lives as if what they feel is correct and is going to be correct. And you want to absolutely stop doing that. It's in essence, it's one of the angles on like the height of insanity. Another angle is, again, presuming that you know what's true without a method for doing so. That's not a cop out. That's not BS, right? You can't do it by willpower. Your mind can't just do it for you and give you the feeling. You need to build it. I've given you most of the ingredients, even though maybe we haven't put them together in a clear way yet. But we'll continue on. I think what I want to do, I'm going to see how this turns out as I work on it this week. For the next couple sessions, I want to show you how you're more about specifically about how the default method of our mind works with successive approximation and various things like that. I think seeing that alternative can help as well. Seeing where this so-called foundational stuff that our mind gives us, but it's not, where reality, like that seems so real, where it's coming from. I think like looking at that directly and seeing how it isn't foundational will be helpful. So I'm going to look to do that next time and see how that turns out. Okay, interesting webinar. I don't know, you know, when I went into evolution for a while, I couldn't really know, and I can't know now, and probably never know whether that was the most effective thing I could have talked about for an hour. But it was what I talked about. So there's something about it that was just very powerful for me. So it's hard to know how powerful it might be for you guys. Of course, for me, it was a lot of knowledge and stuff I read about, and then seeing people talk past each other, and then seeing them not get a common ground first before talking. And that's when I realized I've never again really argued with someone once I realized this. We either get our method of thinking and discussing straight, or there's, you know, I don't really bother. One thing I can do though, and this is interesting, a big way I use the law of non-contradiction, and this will be helpful to elaborate on in the future for sure for me. Probably when I talk about relationships, I can get into this more, or influence, or just how I talk to people about things. If you kind of a little bit ask people questions about something that they're saying that you realize is wrong, or you want to move them to something different, you ask them questions that kind of lead them to see more clearly how it's a contradiction. But you don't want to be like, wait, but look at it this way. That's a contradiction. Don't you see you're contradicting yourself? You have to kind of lead them to like see it for themselves, kind of gently, unless they're really one of you guys and interested in really seeing things clearly and they're seeking it themselves. Then you can do it a lot quicker with them. So if you have people that are kind of embracing seeking understanding and so forth, then you can go straight after seeing things right. But if they're not, which is most cases practically speaking in life at this point, then you kind of gently lead them sometimes to seeing how something's a contradiction. And usually on the surface, if it's deep down, then they still won't want to see it, and they'll really get agitated or really want to stay blurry. So it isn't even like I can make major changes. Good, excellent, Rajdeep. At least one person thought this stuff was quality. See what Deborah wrote here. And I'm not going to do too much discussion here because we're already pretty long. But Deborah wrote, as I hear you, David, you are cautioning us on looking deeply into the logical models we hold as some sort of ultimate truth, using the theory of evolution as an example. You are suggesting that without questioning our models of reality, we're blindly following what we have been fed by society, authority figures, right? Yeah, like for people that believe in evolution, it's mainly because they've just been so powerfully triangulated. They have kind of a blurry, zoomed out view from 40,000 feet that seems to make sense. Right? I didn't describe that view, but everyone's aware of that standard way of thinking about evolutionary theory that feels right, you know. Between that kind of blurry view and then authority figures reinforcing it, disdaining those who think it's wrong. And it shows, I mean, it's fascinating that someone could be totally wrong. And I know I haven't necessarily convinced everyone that evolution is totally wrong or not. And that was why I went into it for as long as I did. Because if you don't go into a certain amount of detail and develop it, that, you know, it's either kind of, you go kind of somewhat all in or nothing. I mean, fully all in would be, you know, spending dozens of hours on it. But still, I went kind of all in for alchemy, you know, and spending an hour on it. But they're not only wrong, but they're condescending as hell about it. And their salary is based on, they're like paid. There's people, you know, like based on this. That's where their money's coming from. It's all subsidized, of course. All right, it's all big one money laundering scheme. But it's extraordinary, you know. You are suggesting that we need to question these theories or belief systems that have been ingrained in us to free our minds. It isn't that you even need to question these theories. You need to question your system by which you come to your beliefs. You see, it's not about questioning authority. It's about questioning your method that gets you to ever go with authority in the first place. It's how could evolutionary theory have seemed reasonable? That's the thing, and unimportant, perhaps. Either it seemed important and it seemed correct, or it seemed unimportant. But it's very foundational because like our story of how we got here is pretty obviously one of the places that has the potential to be foundational. If someone's poking around trying to understand themselves and life and how existence works and how thinking works in their minds, then evolution is one of the pretty obvious places to poke. You're not poking very hard if you don't poke there, right? It's almost like if someone wants to make money for themselves and they're not checking out the internet, then it's like, all right, you might want to check out the internet, right? Even if you have a brick and mortar business, the internet's probably plays some major part of things. So you're not looking. Sometimes you're not looking very hard if you're not looking in certain obvious places. But you need to question like your method for gaining beliefs. It's not that you need to question your model for reality. You need to question your method for acquiring that model. And again, what I'm looking to do next week, Saturday and Monday, is to look at how that model got formed, look at the method by which it got formed, instead of just talking about the correct method. And I've talked about this all the way through a little bit here and there, but I'll try to go specifically and devote a couple sessions to it, and it'll help to loosen it or make it more ridiculous. Kind of like what I did for evolution here, where to some degree I made it look ridiculous. Isn't it funny about the monkey? How hard is it to just figure out the monkey would freaking starve before typing out Shakespeare? And then you say, well, okay, what if you feed the monkey? Right? And okay, so you're replacing the ink. Anyway, there's a point where how is this a metaphor for evolution anymore? Right? Because it really is a great metaphor for evolution when the monkey starves. Because what actually happens when something mutates is it doesn't work. It works less. Or if you make an RNA in a prebiotic soup, it'll just decompose. So that's what's actually happening. Even if you make a whole cell, it'll get irradiated. The original environment on the Earth was like worse than Chernobyl. Chernobyl didn't like create a whole bunch of smarter, better people. Did it? It killed people. That's what mutation actually does. And natural selection should turn us all into bacteria, right? Well, who's better at making great kids than bacteria? Deborah, it's taking me a very long time to come to the understanding that so much of what each of us believes to be true is what actually limits us to achieving our highest potential because it is a mental box. Right. And again, I can't stress enough, it's not so much about questioning. Many people don't, but a small percentage of people, but a lot of people here already question stuff and question their model. But what you need to do is question something deeper than that. You need to question your very sanity. You need to question whether you're mostly just a totally evil person even. And I'm not saying you are. I just mean that if you're not willing to ask questions like that, maybe by default I'm just insane and evil until I climb out of it. I mean, what was I? I had insane evil beliefs, a whole bunch of them. I'm perfectly comfortable saying that, we're a mix, right? But I had a whole bunch of beliefs that were just crazy and insane and dangerous to myself and other people. And it's fairly normal. I don't mean that I was fairly normal, but I had a lot of ideas that are fairly normal, but they're also really hurting myself and other people. I had to resolve a bazillion contradictions and blocks and so forth. And of course, I'm not claiming perfection now whatsoever. I do some things perfectly, just like I talked about hitting a target, but my mind certainly still has issues. But boy, have I resolved a lot, and I'm so much better off. And it's constant that I do things in a way that I wouldn't have done things, or think about things in a way that I wouldn't have thought things before I started resolving a lot of the issues and contradictions and applying alchemy and law of implication. There's just every day. And the number of times OMG would never have gotten off the ground or failed or been so much worse if I hadn't been operating on things that I had changed There's no way. It wouldn't even come close. So when I say this is what I've used, to become a multimillionaire, I had some little bit of talent with information businesses and teaching, but not much. You know? But mostly it was just applying this consistently. And there's so many times nonstop that without the changes that I made, there's no way it would have happened. Oh, that's great. Excellent. Got another one. Rajdeep, and then Shema said that was incredible to go through evolutionary theory. Wow, great. Right. Time does not make the impossible possible. That's exactly right. Exactly. Right. If you give a monkey a typewriter and some paper and give him infinite time, what will happen at the end of 10 bazillion years is the monkey will be dead and decompose. Right? That's it. And people say, like, given an infinite amount of time, anything can happen. That's actually not true. Uh, um, that disregards local peaks, basically. Like if you program a robot to take a step, and if that step takes it higher up on a bunch of peaks, like local peaks, and then if the step does not take it, sorry, the step takes it higher, keep going in the same direction. If the step takes it lower or the same, then turn at random, because it can't see, right? That's kind of inherent within this illustration. Then the algorithm would have to be like what I just said. Then it would get stuck in a local peak for infinity, essentially. You see? That's what actually happens. If you put apologies for this, but if you put a frog in a blender for an infinite amount of time, you're not going to get a bird, right? You just get a more blended frog. Basic stuff. Question everything, examine everything, except, you see, you can't live by that really. So what you need to do is move past that and get some things right that you can stand on. You see? So you question your method of getting belief, your method of knowledge. But then you need to get to the point where you have building blocks and you have things correct, because you do need to move forward at some point. You can't just sit around questioning. And so questions do have answers, and they have answers that are knowable. I've given you a whole bunch of knowable answers, right, this whole time in alchemy about all kinds of important stuff. And again, sometimes you just know that the opposite isn't where the answer is, and so, but you narrow it down, right? If you have two piles of M&Ms, and one pile has around 10, and one pile has around 1,000, and I were to say which one's bigger, you could tell me which one's bigger with basically perfect correctness every time, even if I varied the amount by 10. You could do it every single time. So even without knowing the exact amount of M&Ms, you know enough that you could identify which one's the bigger pile if the difference is big enough, right? So the mismatching, law of non-contradiction, and so forth. You can compile all kinds of things even if a lot of those things aren't the exact answer yet. You need to be comfortable with not putting the whole jigsaw puzzle together at once, right? With crossing off opposites and things like that. Shema says your discussion on evolution is powerful. Also to see alchemy in action with you, how you think through and mix. Right, exactly. I just kind of caught the moment and wanted to take you through that in kind of real time. Rick says, I always look at the source behind the information. Do they have an agenda or political motive for their own self-interest? They're really coming from a non-biased position. Right, and if they have non-bias, then that's something you know. You still don't know if what they're saying is correct. Now, it might be in the absence of having anything that you could reasonably have much more confidence in, you might go with what they're saying, but you don't need to say that you know it. Instead, you can cross off things you do know or check off things you do know. Okay, this source is less biased than this other source. So in a vacuum, I'll go with a less biased source. But then maybe you could, but maybe the biased source still is right and the non-biased source is wrong. Right? When I talk about speed reading, or back in the day when I talked about speed reading, it would look like a professor of psychology would be non-biased. It would look like I'd be biased because I was selling a speed reading course, right? But actually, they're weirdly biased to believe what they actually have a hidden bias, and to believe that, well, they wouldn't miss something that big, or that they would have heard of it, or just that they want to sound smart, or there have been experiments you can easily do an experiment where you supposedly teach someone how to speed read wrong, and then they don't get a benefit. So they have discovered methods of teaching speed reading or reading normally, I would think of it, but reading more efficiently that don't work, right? I could easily prove that teaching someone how to swim freestyle faster doesn't help them to swim faster by simply not teaching them effectively, right? And then I could prove that so to speak, um, that method doesn't help. But anyway, so it doesn't mean that one is right and the other is wrong. But in a vacuum, yeah, you'd probably go with the person who's not biased. Um, and then you'd look to have more, information. And even if you don't have a way to know which answer is correct, the more things you do know, especially if including that you yourself are seeking understanding and not bias, because you can accumulate a whole list of things you supposedly know, but if you start out biased, then you can easily just accumulate, a BS list where you know it, right? For either political candidate right now or major political candidate, anyone could compile a list 100 things long about problems with one of the candidates, and it would look overwhelming, right? You um, uh, until you found a way to look at it more clearly, right? Figure out what's important separately, and so forth. Lou, this whole course, OMG, has lifted the curtain for a lot of things for me. I'm definitely a lot more skeptical now. Uh, excellent, excellent. So you want to be skeptical, and then you also want to, of course, build things you know. Um, Please expand on how evolution is used to justify violence. Let me see if I can do a 1 minute answer on that. Oh, well, I mean, like, obviously World War II and the whole Hitler. Socialism is basically that ideology, which is responsible for, 100 million or many more than 100 million deaths, right? Um, I mean, evolution as like a reason is not foundational. Like there's something deeper, which is like people, ultimately you can get down to people um, not knowing how to know what's true properly and not caring about that as the fundamental problem with justifying violence. Evolution is more of a intermediate step along the line, but it's pretty much the root of the whole communist and socialist ideologies. Certainly, there have been wars over religion, right? Obviously, we're seeing that now as well with militant versions of some wonderfully peaceful religions that I'd rather not name so I don't get my head cut off by the peaceful religion. Um, but certainly overconfidence in dogma and revelation and sources, um, like basically what's called religion in some cases, has led to violence. However, lots of incredibly wonderful things have been done in the name of religion. It's a little hard to figure out what's been done that's wonderful in the name of evolution. And if you take some of the things that they say in terms of evolution as a premise, like, oh, the real purpose um, is to have more offspring, right, or any kind of natural selection type stuff, then that could be used to justify rape, right? Especially if you're a guy, right? You spread your seed as much as you can, and that's just justified with evolution. John, why do you say we don't need to know how the species got here? What if we want to know? How can we know what's true about how species are defined? Um, it's actually fairly easy. Sorry, the answer to this. So I don't mean to be difficult. Independently and separately, like looking at the physical world to try to figure out where things came from is looking in the wrong place. You're not going to find out the answer is looking there as a starting. You need to look in your conscious field and develop from there. Once we do that and we understand that God has to exist, and then we understand that abundance within consciousness fields, abundance for beings, abundance of goodness for beings, is the purpose of everything. So everything can be explained in terms of beings having the potential, which can lead to the actual, for more goodness, more and more goodness. Everything in the world of reasons is towards that end. Why is it not choreographed so that we all have bliss all the time right now? I've talked about that in the proof of God thing, and I think other places, is that it would remove our capacity for love. Also, given that God exists and God isn't fooled by anything, God can't be deceived, God's aware of everything that exists, then if God is doing something, it has to be correct. There might be things that God doesn't know about the future. So there actually can be things that potentially could be known that God doesn't know. Sorry, not potentially could be known. There's things that could be, once they're built, they could be known or whatever. The future can't potentially be known in one sense, but it could be known as you get to it. Which means even God could be poking around. Nothing's bad until there's conscious beings experiencing bad in their consciousness field. So if, for example, animals are not conscious and single-celled organisms, we don't even think they're conscious anyway, there's nothing bad that could be done, that God could have done all kinds of stuff over what we would call 4.6 billion years. Until there's conscious beings. And there'd be no such thing as it being bad or good. There'd be no value judgment if there's no consciousness involved. I'm not trying to make a statement one way or the other about whether animals or whether animal bodies and minds are attached to conscious beings. I don't know the answer to that, but I don't really see how they could be. But I don't want to say something definitively. We can tell that faunal succession happened. We can tell the Earth is 4.6 billion years old according to the same model that we use for everything else, right? Just like we can tell that the sun exists and it operates in a certain way. Just like we can tell that how a car works and build cars and build cell phones that work, right? We can discover things about the physical world. We can, if I'm digging in my backyard and I discover a bicycle of that sort that was ridden 100 years ago, then I can understand that something about that. That wouldn't give me no information, right? If it was clearly very decomposed in some way, then it wouldn't have been buried yesterday, right? So just judging, just using kind of normal, obvious, clear science of the sort that there's a point when science, the big obvious science stuff just works, right? I'm not saying anything complicated there, just something simple. So we can tell that faunal succession happened, right? If the Earth was like 10,000 years old, then to have the fossils and the oil and so forth that we have, there would have had to be all at once existing animals that would have been piled high, like for miles, like up in the sky. Like you just couldn't have enough organisms in 10,000 years for what we see buried. Could they have never existed and God just made the result of it? Well, there's really no difference in saying that versus saying that, like basically, there's no difference in saying, well, could God have done everything like what happened in an instant? Or would it take 4.6 billion years old? It's actually the same. It's the same statement, weirdly enough. Up until you have conscious beings, then things would have had to happen in steps. And there's no difference between, as long as all the steps of 4.6 billion years old were done, it's not relevant to say whether it actually took 4.6 billion years old. There's no actually in that way. Time in the world of reasons has a different meaning, just like a road. Just like the gray of a road exists, there's certain qualities that only exist in a consciousness field. Time, as it appears to us consciously, only exists in your consciousness field. Time, the code for time, the code aspect of time or whatever, just like the code for a road exists in the world of reasons in the physical world. There is something in the world of reasons that's real, that that's related to the road. Similarly, there's something like that with time in the world of reasons in the physical world, but the physical world isn't foundational in a certain way. But anyway, faunal succession basically happened, to put it simply, um, and the species were created with some combination of God following natural laws and God interfering with natural laws. There's no way that natural laws as they stand can't make evolution. If they could, that wouldn't be a problem for my ideology or belief system, but they just don't. It's just a simple thing. Um, just like dissolving salt in water doesn't cause an explosion. It just doesn't. Right? That's just physical laws are such that if I were to say that um, if I were to say that 1,000 years ago there was salt was mixed in water and there was a big explosion, and that's what caused this volcano, then that just wouldn't be a correct scientific theory if I said that. Right? That it was the mixture of salt and water that started an explosion that caused a volcano or that caused a landslide. And similarly, physical laws just don't lead to evolution. They lead to stability of species. They don't lead to species to jumping. So God would have had to interfere in the process one way or the other. And it's kind of that simple. And God is obviously doing the whole thing in order. Everything is built around beings with consciousness fields that are with the capacity to like love and have free will. That's the purpose for everything. The purpose for everything, the purpose for the world of reasons is to be the reason for why conscious beings experience their conscious field. I can say that definitively, and you can just work through it yourself if you want more clarity on that. And I don't say that in the least bit negatively or anything like that. I'm more. I don't want people to depend on me more than they should. I'll do all the time that I do with you, that I'll end up doing. But at some point, there's always going to be a limit, and so I caution you about any of these things you can kind of take with and run, but that should give you an indication of things. Method for how to know what's true. I want to plant the seed in my kids' minds. Amen. Hallelujah. Exactly right. One of the obviously alchemy is what we need to be doing for our kids. Right? We need to understand this stuff in order to help guide our kids to either understand it or have the precursors to understanding it for sure, and for us not to reinforce the wrong stuff. You tell someone who's I've mentioned this before, right? You tell someone who's 6 or 10 or whatever, think about that. Better to say think about how to think about that. You say think about it. It skips over that step, right? That I've talked about in different places. I think I talked about this in like the intro, my kind of intro that I made for law of implication. That's in I think most members' areas. The alchemy is about not skipping this fundamental step. It's not skipping the step of ignoring the fact that seems and how things seem and how things are regarding our confidence of knowing and everything is the same. We don't skip over our method for knowing what's true. So with your kids, yeah, don't skip over that. Say, well, that's a good reason to think about how to know what's true. And you don't need to rush, of course, you don't need to rush them. But what we don't want to do is to imply that we should skip over that step. Good quote by Thomas Jefferson, I think. Yes, yeah, God definitely, yeah, exactly. God approves of reason. We have to think clearly, because seems and is. And if I were to guess, which no one's asking me, but anyway, just because it's out there in culture a little bit here and there, but I think the idea of the devil is a personification. It's kind of a way of picturing this idea of skipping over, this idea of seeking understanding, of using reason, but not using reason based on having the foundation already, right? Using reason on the foundation itself, on the method of knowing itself. Generally, when people use reason, they use reason off of assuming the foundation and going from there. And alchemy is all about let's not assume that anymore. Let's use reason on our foundation itself. The interconnectedness and interdependence of life. I don't have much useful to say about that. Um, Off the top of my head. It's about, again, it's about our consciousness field. It's about what will lead to more goodness, right? Wiping out species, mistreating our environment, um, libertarianism, property rights, right? You want to respect shared property. You want to respect other people's property, which includes not destroying it or polluting it overly. Um, that is a place where either extreme doesn't make sense, right? We're always going to be uh, quote unquote polluting the environment to some degree by just living, but yet just having respect for it, uh, treating ourselves as about equal to other people and things like that. Um, but when in doubt, we don't first use violence, right? A lot of environmentalism gets twisted as usual to the demagogue ends up getting rich, $100 million or something, and the environment doesn't get changed, right? Yeah, exactly. No, libertarians care about the environment. We just look at it from the point of view of property rights and build off from there. No Hamlet. Excellent. The red pill, absolutely. I've been logged into the matrix all this time until now. Excellent. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Beautiful. Yeah, and you see with the matrix, the problem with it, it was beautiful because they opened up the question, but then it became unsatisfying ultimately because they just went into another box, right? They didn't answer the question. Lol, everything from nothing. Does a computer with no program write a program itself? That's evolution, right? Totally. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, One of the places where intelligent design theory gets it wrong is they slightly misidentify the issue. It's not that we're intelligently designed, right? Like your consciousness field or the way the world appears doesn't need an explanation because it's so so choreographed or so perfectly designed. It needs an explanation just because it is the way it is rather than some other way. That's the only reason. It needs a reason. No matter how screwed up the world might seem, it still needs a reason why it's the way it is rather than some other way. Once we go from there, then we still get to God. We still can understand God is not deceived. We could still understand that however things are, there's a good reason for it, which has to be opening up the idea of a potential for abundance opens up the potential for waste. Simplistically put, giving people free will opens up the potential for waste rather than putting us into like a drug-induced haze of bliss, which obviously is not the way things are. I don't mean a drug-induced haze of bliss on earth where that leads to a problem. I mean like an infinite supported by God, the equivalent of a drug-induced haze where we have no free will, nothing, no playing field where we can affect things, But we do because of the possibility for the abundance of that. The cool thing is we have a backdrop of the correct answers. It's very coherent. James writes, I love how you were using alchemy here and working through these scenarios for us. I thought I was a believer in evolutionary theory, but I don't know if it was a strict belief in evolutionary theory as specifically defined by Darwin or the scientific community and conventional wisdom. And yeah, and by the way, as you go through any kind of fixes to evolution, the fixes end up contradicting the point of the theory itself. So be careful, because again, I could go on for a long time with supposed counter arguments to what I'm saying, but I guarantee you I'll end up being right ultimately. But their counter arguments are going to be, again, like they'll point out like how bacteria evolve by adjusting to antibiotics. But what we're trying to do is explain the existence of life in the first place and the entire diversity of life. And just bacteria changing into resistant bacteria, if that's basically your only example, right? Then, or finches who already have existing variety of longer beaks and harder, like longer, stronger beaks or shorter, weaker beaks, and then seeing how when there's a drought, then the ones with longer beaks, stronger beaks, selectively live more. Um, that or black and white moths in a population already exist, the black and the white, and then if you have soot that makes things where the trees are more black, and then the uh, I don't even think this. I think this was even disproven. I think it was a hoax. But even if that were the case, where now the environment changes and there's more pollution, and so the black moths are less eaten by predators because they blend in more. Again, I think that actual example is a hoax anyway. Um, but just these teeny weeny examples here and there, or these counter arguments that twist the theory, punctuated equilibrium, large periods of things are mostly the same, punctuated by massive change. Well, that doesn't solve my issue with the monkeys. And whatever issue they try to, whatever answer they try to give, neutral drift theory or whatever, they still can't explain why the monkeys are there in the first place, the original monkeys. And I've seen it. I mean, I've done this. I lived this for years and years. I was working on this just specifically. And I was in college, and I would talk to my professors, and I would take courses on actual evolution, like not just biology, but like I took a course called evolutionary biology. I did a report on why evolution is ridiculous. I gave like 6 different things that were totally never been explained, and they're major. They're not like little nitpicky things. And basically, I got a B. And and there was no answer. Not one of those points were refuted during the course or in response to my paper. Such as if you have a cell that gets made, which is totally ridiculous, but if you have a cell that's made in the prebiotic soup, it'll immediately become irradiated and mutate and die. That's just the scientific fact. You need a whole mechanism for repairing the DNA, which cells have in all the cells we observe, or else a cell just dies. It dies very quickly. So you basically need to have it all happen at once, and there's no answer, none given. Right? You'd think that they'd at least explain how evolutionary theory addresses that point in some way, but again, there's not even an attempt at the answers in most cases. The attempt, and whenever they do attempt an answer, it just it proves the rule. The idea that I told you about, you don't get RNA or protein or any of these macromolecules, large molecules that are made of smaller building blocks. Like a protein is made of amino acids, right? Building blocks strung together like a set of beads. That doesn't happen in water. In water, it breaks down based on, I won't get into the chemistry, but that's definitely correct. There's absolutely no one would argue with me on that. So they come up with theories about how you have these amino acids that are forming in a prebiotic soup, and then they dry out, like it washes up onto like a hot beach, and it dries out. And the drying would make it be more of a chain. But then, first of all, that denatures the protein. Second of all, now you've removed the water. But all the action has to happen. Now that nothing mixes, it's just sitting there, right, on a hard surface. And so now it has to get back into the water again to start mixing and forming a cell. And so all these little schemes, they don't work. Even the original experiment in the flask where they got some amino acids to form from the original ingredients. Well, the first time the guy ran the experiment, I'm blanking on his name, might come to me, but I knew it well back in the day. But it's a famous experiment where they took like the so-called original building block, something like either nitrogen gas or was it nitrogen oxide? Maybe nitrates? No, I don't think. No, not. Anyway, just some of the original things: hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and so forth. And he put them in a flask, and he got mostly tar, but he got a few very few amino acids, and the simplest ones. The first time the experiment was run with the conditions that they really thought were there, they got nothing. Then they changed it and rigged it so they get something, and they got a little something of the simplest amino acids in tar, and mostly tar. And the tar is more stable, so the amino acids would break down immediately. And you can just go on and on and on. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But all their little so-called little things, or the panda's thumb, where it doesn't seem to have any evolutionary advantage. It's what is that called? What is it called? Vestigial organs are supposed to be this incredible proof for evolution. Like, why would they exist? And it's just and virtually all of these things. Also, if you just have God tinkering around, I already told you God can't know the future. This is most Most theologians don't understand this, or all of them basically don't know this, as far as I can tell. But God can't know the future because the future doesn't exist. It's infinite, and no one can be aware of an infinite number of things. So God's self, can be trying different combinations and doing stuff, and tinkering around, believe it or not. And no matter what it is, evolutionary theory is so ridiculous. And then everything I said needs an answer. And then saying, well, pandas have thumbs and humans have a vestigial tailbone or hair on their knuckles. Okay. But you still have to explain how that theory positively works with the monkeys evolving and so forth. And a bottom line is, when you just think things through with scenarios, I mean, it gets fascinating. And to finish what you wrote, I completely agree that the truth is defined by experts is not based on a foundation of truth, including mismatching the law of non-contradiction. And when challenged, they will just use bad arguments, fallacies, and equivocation. Absolutely beautiful. I feel like I need to do more mixing and work through more scenarios to be confident in and understand what's true. Absolutely. Absolutely, when it comes to evolution, work through it for yourself. I wasn't trying to make an argument or convince you on this. I was trying to illustrate and demonstrate for you, and point you in the right direction and give you the building blocks so you can go do this for yourself, for sure. Siaka wrote, well said, David, scientists adopt beliefs. And I'll pretty much be not answering many more questions at this point. Well said, scientists adopt beliefs, true or not, and go about to prove them, not disprove. Right, exactly the way minds work. And minds work even worse in groups, right? Like the mistakes that minds make, or the overconfidence gets multiplied in groups, and people think even worse. So the scientific community basically thinks worse than an individual scientist. Numbers actually basically work against. What works in our favor in life is like heroes, like people that pioneer all on their own and discover something. And if you have more numbers, maybe you have more heroes. But as far as I can tell, it's possible that I'm wrong about this historically. But if you look at China versus the U.S., China has 1 billion people, and it's been around for a longer time. But the innovation there nothing seems to be coming out of it these days. And I have a theory for that, which is with all the flaws in America and American government, you still have a culture that somewhat allows for heroes, in the sense of there's still a strain of self, independence, right, and self-reliance or whatever, individualism. And when you kill that, then heroes can't rise up. They're kind of killed or stifled before they can get going. And it isn't the American people. It's individuals that have made the greatness of America to the extent that it's great. Or the greatness of anything else. And heroes in other countries that have come up with great things. It isn't like the people in general. I made OMG certainly to encourage a good culture for everyone, but I made it so that individuals, could rise up and help others and act heroically, and not be stifled as best as I could. It's not always had a perfect environment for that. But I've tried to make it the best environment I could do for that, for my part. Hashtag 10 million. Thank you so much. When their experiments don't, I better read the whole thing once we have read that. When their experiments don't confirm those beliefs, no publications take place. Right, exactly. Yeah, the whole system is crazy these days with scientists, right? You have to publish in order to get money or get grant money from the government, and so you have to conform. The pressure to conform is massive. There's a massive epidemic of confirmation, commitment, and consistency bias to a ridiculous extent beyond comprehension. Yeah, you're exactly right. Question everything, understand enough to build on. Hashtag 10 million, love it, all of it. But is progression not change? Yeah, things do change over time. And in terms of complexity of organisms, yeah, there's been faunal succession, like I said. It just hasn't been driven by chance and natural selection. The physical laws that normally exist, and any logical laws to go along with them, wouldn't result in the history of the Earth and the organisms on it that we see. That's what I'm saying about evolutionary theory. There was progress over time, as far as I can tell from my understanding of science and history and archaeology and logic based on that. Absolutely. There was change over time, there was progress over time. But evolutionary theory says that you can get the whole universe and the diversity in it without God, and just based on the physical laws that we basically currently observe. And that is what I'm saying is not correct. This is such good stuff, David. A little on fire tonight. Well, evolution is something. It's a either fortunate or unfortunate thing. Unfortunate for anyone that's not, would rather talk about something else. But no, it's where my passion. I don't really have a passion for money getting activities. I I greatly respect the idea of making money. I respect the importance of money, and I respect how important it is to have a stable base. And I respect that in OMG, that's how we lure you here in order to talk about alchemy. uh, and I respect selling, making money as a good thing for people to pay for my own stable base financially. But my passion is things like evolution and even like religion, politics, and so forth. So try to have a balance as best I can, or however you want to put it. The point isn't balance, right? But the point is to I think you can figure out what I mean by thinking about it. This is definitely going to require a rewatch. Yeah. Without question, probably multiple. Yeah, anyone that's really a strong evolutionist might want to listen to it a few times. Theory writes, I've been rewatching the entire series already, 1 hour a day. That's awesome. So true about the job factor, David. Once you see there is a way out, there's no looking back. Right, exactly. Yeah, and as a side note, as you go through, from now on, whenever you're either stuck, either because you don't feel like doing what you have to do, or because you're not sure what to do to get what you want to do, or if you feel like someone's getting hurt, or if you're feeling unhappy, look for the contradiction. Look and like say, okay, wait, I can identify where I want to get to, and now that I've identified it, I'm not going to try to do that in one bite. I'm not even going to try to look like I'm making progress directly towards it. I'm going to let go of that, and I'm going to try to identify some things that might be relevant for the law of non-contradiction. I don't even know ahead of time whether crossing certain things off or identifying certain things is going to necessarily do it. But I'll poke around by looking at some things I can tell, well, it's not this, right? Again, if you're thinking, well, I don't want to do this task, well, what if I never do it? Or if you're questioning whether your judgment, is it really true that if I do this thing I don't really want to do, whether it'll help me? And you could say, well, if I just discount my judgment, am I only discounting my own judgment about whether it's going to help me? Because you're assuming that if you're thinking about doing a task and you feel like you kind of want it done, but then you don't want to do it, then implicit within that is that your judgment is that doing it may well help you, right? Kind of has. If you're saying it has to be done, or I think it has to be done, and then you say you're really going to go through your life questioning your judgment about stuff that obvious, right? Like there's some tasks that pretty obviously you're better off doing, right? That you don't want to do, and if you're gonna, and you could say, well, look, if I'm going to question my judgment about whether that task itself is worth doing, I think I'm better off questioning my judgment about whether I'm not going to enjoy doing that task instead, right? Things like that. And as always, I'll look to be pointing out examples of the law of non-contradiction. But when you re-listen to Alchemy, from the beginning, certainly, unless everyone listen to the whole series, 2 or 3 times, you'll go through and it'll be like Sixth Sense to a good degree, right? You'll see all kinds of things that I got to talking about later that I couldn't talk about all in the first webinar. And you'll see me doing it the whole time, where I'm constantly helping us by crossing off the opposite. Yeah, I know, and I've read attempts at at refuting like Michael Behe's book Darwin's Black Box, where he gets into like a lot of detail. I where they try to get into detail too. One thing is always look for clarity rather than blurriness, um, and and especially what I outline with monkeys and stuff, and even with this, either the starting the starting from scratch and trying to get a cell that works, including the fact that it's in an irradiated environment. and just trying to cross species where you picture what actually has to happen to cross species, to go from like a monkey to a human or anything else to anything else, then then there aren't really counterexamples to those things, or there aren't really explanations about those. Sometimes they'll look like they're going into detail, where they'll, like for example, with an eye evolving over time, they'll look like they're going into all kinds of detail, where first there's this organism with a hot spot, and then there's a prototypical eye, and then there's another one, and it'll look like they're like giving such science and everything like that. But then if you drill down even farther into the actual mutations that would have to happen, then it becomes ridiculous, just like the monkey thing. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. They need the blurriness. Wow, I'm still an hour back. Okay, I better wrap this one up. It's been over 3 hours. You're welcome. Wow, such nice feedback, even though I spent a lot of time in evolution. Although I guess people are nice enough not to say, darn it, David. Oh, wow, Tom wrote, thank you, David. This one really hit the spot for me, life-changing. Excellent. Well, that's wonderful. I appreciate your early example of alchemy and applying what you know to one's personal situation. As you say, ask, do I only want to rely upon a job for my income? Right. And as you say, there are many things that are restricted that one cannot do if one is bound to a job. Yeah. Once you know this, then you'll never go back. Right. Yeah, I found there's so many things instead of willpower. Great. That's a big aha moment for Chris. I'm so glad. Yeah. I don't like either almost completely or completely, but to some huge degree, I don't really use willpower. I just cross off things that are pretty clearly not the case, and then it's not that hard to do what I have to do, to figure out what I have to do. Mind blown. I'm ready for the replay. You did it to me again, David. Love alchemy. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you, Federico. Very interesting webinar. Thanks. Thank you. Can't wait to re-listen to this. Excellent. Yeah, a lot of stuff in here. Blurriness, follow the money. Yeah, I love it. Rather wishing there could be a discussion later. Wrapping this thought into a field of understanding is going to take a moment. Yeah. Well, I'd love to discuss this. It's pretty darn likely that, like maybe what I'll do is go through September like this, and then maybe we'll just be able to get on webinars and discuss. It's super easy for me to just hop on a webinar. I don't have to with the way they are now, I have to really kind of plan my day around alchemy in a lot of ways, and twice a week. But if we're just doing some discussion, especially like later, and if I could skip some weeks, like during OMG Live or so forth, but maybe we might just do plenty of discussion. We'll see. Thank you, Ernie. I'm so glad. You're welcome, Karen. Thanks, Leslie. I have insane evil thoughts too, but mostly has to do with whether or not I can get away with a bag of macaroni and cheese flavored Lay's potato chips without a 3-mile run. That's terrific. Awesome. Yeah, linear commenting. Still, Facebook works pretty well, right? I kind of like it for this stuff. And I like the way it's saved. All these threads are saved in OMGUA forever, so we can always search them, and I can search them and go through them. Thank you, David. I've never bought into the evolutionary model, especially those folks that condescendingly try to shove it down by sheer force, but without any real logical basis. Oh, yeah, because I was saying that with intelligent design, it's based on the idea that things are intelligently designed, and I think it's Richard Dawkins that correctly shoots down that argument by calling it like the law of personal incredulity that a lot of creationists and intelligent design people use, wow, look at that flower, it's so amazing that it can come to be, I can't believe that could evolve. So it's like you're personally incredulous, and that's their argument. They're right, that those intelligent design people are ultimately right, but it doesn't really work with evolutionists because they don't quite get it perfect. It reminds me so much of when conservatives argue for liberty instead of individual property rights. And liberty is just a little bit off, kind of like intelligent design theory is just a little bit off. It's not exactly right, even though it's basically right. Liberty is basically a good concept, but liberty doesn't really hit the nail on the head. And then conservatives still end up having all these ways where they sacrifice individuals for the greater good in the name of liberty. Or they don't fight hard enough they don't see hard enough the individual property rights violations, which You just have to fully and completely cross off any individual property rights violations ever, except in direct response and trying to remedy against the exact individual that's violating. Because as soon as you open the door, just a little bit of a crack, it's game over. Because you can always solve pretty much any societal problem better if you just violate someone's property rights, and then it just becomes a game of obfuscating it better and making it hurt the least, right? And you get these like convoluted schemes, but they're all rooted in just violating people's property rights, right? With certain types of regulations that do violate property rights. I'm not saying all regulations do, but a lot do. And then, of course, just direct taxation and things like that. And you wrote, I always wonder why any species persists if it was supposed to have evolved into something better. Oh, and sorry, and then what creationists will write is they'll just directly say, we admit that creationism is a theory and you can't prove that God exists, absolutely. So, but neither can you prove evolutionary theory. Incorrect. And I always just didn't like that. And I searched. Before I knew the answer, I searched for it. I wasn't satisfied. I thought you could prove that God exists, and I looked for a way. Not just, oh, well, evolutionary is a theory, and so is creation. Creation is a theory, but so is evolution. It's just a theory. Forget about whether it's a theory or not. It's just plain wrong. Just like my theory of a volcano, if a volcano came, volcanoes are made from salt mixing in water and then exploding. Right? Salt just does not explode in water, period. To say that it does, we just have to throw out any kind of science whatsoever. At that point, it would become ridiculous. Thank you for clearing away the cobwebs again. Yeah, obviously people have great cognitive bias towards explaining things without God. And it's not just that, though, that evolutionists don't want to believe in God. You have to realize something, and this is kind of goes along with this deeper idea that I keep communicating. People that are religious, theists, Christians, and other religions as well. I'm never specifically trying to pick on Christians. I am a Christian. But Christians included is what I'm saying. They get too many things wrong. And they need to stop. Jesus didn't get things wrong, but people that are Christians, like in practice, Christians have a lot of beliefs that are just not reasonable. And so that's why it's rejected by a lot of people, and they wanted something else, right? If the original government of the United States was set up even better, then maybe it wouldn't have needed the rebellion. And maybe it's just that some people just want to have tyranny, right? Some people just want to gain power and they become demagogues. But still, certainly it's a sadness for me. I think if conservatives had gotten things right instead of not getting things quite right, then you wouldn't need the rebellion against conservatism, which practically speaking, my judgment is that it's worse, right? Because I prioritize things like taxation and really burdensome regulation, and just the government just feeling like an absolute enemy towards people trying to do business, and anything outside of the government's hand, where feeling like you're just directly enemies with the government, right? I don't like that, and so conservatives are better with that, and that's why I prefer them. I understand. I understand the emotions that a lot of leftists can feel. There are problems with conservatism, and I agree with some of the problems that leftists feel. But ultimately, I think they need to look at what they're accepting along with what they're upset about, and look for libertarianism instead. I would say that would be the answer if someone identifies as being left wing. I think what you're really looking for is libertarianism. And I understand the belief that maybe government can just do all kinds of good things, but if you see that government is really rooted in violence and extortion, then you're just not going to get good stuff from that seed. Oh no, I don't have anything about speed reading or accelerated learning these days, and I use a device that I no longer know how to get. So sorry about that. I'll look to come up with something at some point, because a lot of people ask me about that. Stunning session, David Mills. My guess is you did not have carbs beforehand. That's right. I didn't. I just had the one nutty super grain from Smoothie King, and then I had a latte from Barnes and Noble. I guess technically there might have been some carbs in the latte somewhere, but that's about it. Beautiful, Irene. Exactly right. Irene writes, thank you, David. Awesome lesson today. God can handle our doubts and questions, as truth can always withstand examination and still be true. Beautifully put. That rocks. That's exactly right. Exactly right. Maybe Brian kind of writes or asks, maybe addictions are a symptom of no free will. No, you have, I wouldn't put it exactly that way. Um, but you can over time guide your mind to a better and better place. You use your free will to guide your mind to a better and better place, to dissolve contradictions. And as you do that, then addictions can be one of the things that can go. But you always do have free will. It's just a question of whether you're exercising it within a context that's set for you by your mind, which means you're basically not exercising it in the important way that you need to, or you exercise it looking to get out and build back up, get down to the foundation and build back up. But you can even do that while being addicted to some stuff, and then the addiction could come later. Megan, absolutely earth-shaking. Love this series. So understandable. Wow, that's great. And yet completely radical for today's craziness. I'm getting crazy stuff like understandable, clarity. I don't necessarily think that everyone feels that way, but I'm glad. What's your take on evolutionary psychology? I approach everything from, I basically don't use evolution as an explanatory thing. What you can use to explain the point of the world is to give us hints about understanding God and our relationship with God, and that we should love other people, and so forth. So that's why things are the way they are. We can explain, however, God also rigged our minds to help us survive as individuals and as a species. That's what explains so much that people use evolution to explain. So this might be eye-opening for people. People say, oh, we evolved this to survive this. No, God obviously programmed our minds to give us default urges and so forth, and motivations to propagate both ourselves as individuals to survive and as a species. Obviously, with our wanting to have sex and so forth, despite the fact that it results in kids. Uh, so and so much more about that. And then another thing you can do is then take a look at how women's bodies are, how women give birth and are the people that are by default, and they have to nurse the child. And so you can look at the difference in psychology with the propensities that women have versus men. If you imagine just a tribe where women are having the babies and nursing them and basically caring for them when they're young, mostly, and the men are going out and hunting and going out into the environment and having to bring back stuff. If you use that simple thing, that can help to predict gross differences, like kind of vectors that are on a woman and on men. Of course, individuals can vary greatly. You only use this to open up questions to realize differences. Realizing differences can help you get out of your one perspective that you see the world in. That's the point. Of course, the point is not to impose a stereotype on an individual, right? But it can. But the good thing about seeing gender differences is it gets you. Without that, you can see everything through the lens of your gender, without realizing it. And I would say just experientially, scientifically, which you can't know things perfectly that way, but I mean that it's so obvious and overwhelming that there's some degree of difference overall in the general push on a woman, on women versus men, and how they see things and feel things. But it all is predictable. You don't have to use evolution at all. You can just go from my little scenario I built you, where you have just kind of a tribal situation, and you imagine women caring for the young, and you imagine men going out and having to hunt and farm more. Although women can kind of farm within kind of the enclosure, you know, and men especially mostly going out and into the environment and bringing stuff back, and all the ripple effects in terms of personality, how in one case cooperation, societal cooperation, makes more sense. In the other case, there's like cooperation to achieve a mission, but then competition kind of against the environment or against maybe opposing tribes if necessary, things like that. Um, uh, And how a woman will have like a woman would you would predict that a woman would want to have the man stick around because they have a child and have to nurse it for a long time, like be pregnant for 9 months, be helpless, be relatively helpless during some of that time, and then having to take care of a helpless infant, which takes a lot of attention. So they'd want one man who's going to stick around, whereas with a man, in order to would have two kind of has two conflicting things. Um, One is to stick around also, but the other is to impregnate various women, right? You kind of have to you kind of have two tugs in you if you're a guy, because both would help you. Basically either one would help you. Sorry, help you have your offspring survive is what I mean. I don't mean help you morally or actually as an individual. Fletcher, this is kind of cool. I sit here nearly dumbstruck as I try to comprehend and understand the world being made of reasons. In and out of that experience, but wow, I get it, even if I don't fully live it every minute, a step in the path. Yeah, it's so cool, right? It's like a totally different way of thinking about things, but without it, you run into this blurriness wall where you're like this quicksand when you try to think about what words mean and who we are and so forth. It's the only way out. And I agree, it's kind of crazy, right? But I mean, this is all really the same for me as it is for you guys. I've maybe been doing it longer. Um, and I don't really look at you guys ultimately as like apprentices or anything. I look at us more as colleagues, but just where I'm coming back with a bunch of experiments and discoveries that I've made within a field that we're all working on and interested in, if that makes sense. But if I go off and discover something for 10 or 20 years and come back, um, and if I fundamentally don't look at things in terms of being superior or whatever, I just am excitedly bringing back to you what I've discovered that we're all interested in, and that I view us all ultimately as equals with, except for the fact that I've discovered what I've discovered. Of course, might have intimate knowledge of what I've been working on for the past 10 or 20 years, but ultimately I view us as equals regarding alchemy and so forth. And so you probably get what I mean. Like, I might know more details than you right now, but I don't view us fundamentally differently. Uh, or as me as like ultimately the teacher. I'm just showing you what I've been working on for the last 10 or 20 years, at which point we'll all be kind of working on it more together. And I'm still trying to discover stuff myself, you know? So that's kind of how I look at it. Excellent. Is that a 10 million, Mike? Yep. Had to close one eye to get it, but no, is it? Excellent. Noble thoughts, sitting on a hill. This webinar was a home run. What a great testimony for the power and necessity of alchemy thinking. Oh, great. So we're wrapping up here. Default urges, excellent. Um, and then finally, I'll read last two. Thank you, David, for a wonderful Webby. Thank you so much. David Mills, eliminating the contradicting issues clarifies what you need to do. In psychology, what you're describing is labeled as cognitive dissonance. Yep, I think I've used that term, actually. That's a term I use fairly often myself, Deborah. And the mind cannot stay in that state for very long, correct. This alchemy session really helps me with staying the course I've chosen. Yeah, and I can talk about how by default the mind will often resolve this and how we want to resolve it intentionally, right, and smartly with scenarios and correct thinking. Okay, guys, thank you so much. We've gone, this is a record webinar here in terms of length, and still a lot of people on, my goodness, and had a good amount of people on the whole time, and still a lot. All right, I will end it here. Thank you guys for sticking around and encouraging. And hey, Jason, awesome. You're very welcome. But it's great, and I look forward to next week. It should be fun, and kind of simple, easy stuff next week. Maybe a little bit of bunch of preparation will go into it, but it should be cool to do. You are very welcome, guys. I'll do a fairly quick goodbye this time, given that we've been around for so long. Take care, guys. Have a great night.